The email came in just after sunset when the house was quiet, and I thought the day was finally over. A single line, cold, sharp, final. Don't come to your sister's wedding. Just watch the live stream, okay? I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for, I don't know, a second line, a reason, something that didn't feel like a door slamming in my face after a lifetime of pretending that door was ever open. But I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply typed back, sure, enjoy your big day. And I meant every word, though, not in the way they expected. Because here's the thing, no one in my family ever understood. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Distance doesn't mean indifference. And when someone like me finally stops trying, the ground tends to shift. The next morning, their phones lit up like a fire alarm, call after call, message after message, suddenly desperate for the daughter they'd spent years pushing to the edges. But me, I wasn't picking up. I had something far more important to do. Because what they didn't know, what they absolutely never saw coming, is that the wedding they tried so hard to keep me out of was the very place everything they thought they controlled would finally fall apart. And trust me, you'll want to see how it happens. My name is Danielle Foster. I'm 36 years old and I work as a financial consultant in a small firm I built from the ground up. Most people who meet me now see a calm, steady woman who keeps her life in order. But the truth is that steadiness was shaped by years of learning how to survive the uneven ground of my own family. When I think back to my childhood, the first thing that always rises in my mind is the difference between how my sister Megan and I were treated. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost gentle, the way the tide pulls the sand from under your feet without you noticing until you start to sink. Megan was the sunny one, the pretty one, the one everyone called our little star. And I was the one who made sure things didn't fall apart in the background. I grew up watching Megan glow under every spotlight, every school play, every birthday, every family dinner. I remember standing just outside the circle of laughter, holding the coats or passing the plates, hearing my mother say, "Isn't Megan wonderful?" and waiting for her to say something about me too. She rarely did. I learned early not to expect it. Most afternoons were the same. Megan would sit on the couch flipping through magazines or talking about boys while I washed dishes or folded laundry. If I asked for help, the answer was always, "Let her rest. Danielle, she's had a long day, even if Megan's day had been nothing more than school and a snack." When I asked why I couldn't rest too, no one ever seemed to hear the question. I wasn't angry then. I don't think children get angry the way adults do. I was just confused, trying to understand why my efforts were invisible, while Megan's smallest accomplishment was celebrated like newsworthy triumph. One memory stands sharper than any other. My high school graduation. It was a warm June evening, the kind where the air smells like cut grass and possibility. I had worked hard, quietly, consistently, and finished near the top of my class. I remember standing in my cap and gown scanning the bleachers for my family. My father had promised they would all be there. I had even asked him twice to be sure, but they weren't. I waited long after the ceremony ended, watching other families take pictures, hearing them call their children's names with pride. A couple of teachers stopped to congratulate me, and I smiled, but inside I felt something break in a way I couldn't yet understand. When I finally got home, still wearing my gown, still holding the folded programme, Megan was in the living room showing off a new hairstyle she'd gotten that afternoon. My mother looked at me as if surprised to see me there so soon. My father said, "Oh, honey, it ran long, didn't it?" as if they had been inconvenienced by my absence instead of the other way around. That night I sat on the floor of my bedroom and promised myself I would never expect too much from anyone again. If I wanted something, I would work for it. If I needed comfort, I would learn to provide it for myself, and above all, I would never compete with Megan for attention. That was a game she was built to win before it even began. Those years shaped the person I became, a woman who keeps her voice steady, who carries more than she says, who forgives too easily and asks for nothing in return. People often tell me I have the patience of a saint, but patience is just what grows when you learn no one is coming to rescue you. You start rescuing yourself quietly one day at a time. Even as an adult, the patterns continued in small ways. Family holidays where Megan's complaints were soothed and mine brushed aside. Phone calls where my updates seemed to drift past them, while Megan's plans were discussed with shining enthusiasm. I told myself it was fine. I had my own life now. My own work, my own home, my own peace. And for a long time, I honestly believed I had left the old wounds behind. I believed I was stronger than the girl who waited alone at her own graduation. I believed the distance I kept from my family had protected me from being hurt again. I thought those days were behind me. Until that evening. That thought was still settling in my mind as I moved through the days that followed, unaware of how quickly the quiet life I had built for myself was about to shift. For years, I had kept a careful distance from my family, not out of anger, but out of self-protection. When you are raised in a house where your presence feels more like background noise than something cherished, you learn to build a world where you can breathe. That was what I had done. I created a life that didn't depend on validation, where my worth did not rise or fall with someone else's attention. I poured myself into work, not because it was all I had, but because it was the one place where my effort produced something real, measurable, and respected. My consulting firm had started as a small idea, just me, at a second-hand desk in a rented room above a bakery 12 years ago, running numbers until midnight. I helped retirees straighten out their investments. Small business owners understand their budgets, and young couples plan for the future. I didn't advertise much. Clients found me through word of mouth. Over time, that little office grew into something solid and dependable. Today, I had 3 employees, a stable roster of long-term clients, and enough savings to make decisions without fear. People often told me I had a gift for explaining complicated things in a way that calmed them. That meant more to me than they knew. I understood what it felt like to live in confusion and uncertainty. I wanted to make sure no one who worked with me ever felt that way. But none of this mattered to my family. They thought I worked in some office, a phrase they used so casually, it almost sounded like a shrug. I never corrected them. It wasn't worth the effort. My father still asked every Christmas, "So how's that little job of yours?" even though I hadn't held a job in over a decade. My mother once told a cousin at Thanksgiving that Megan had the ambitious career, even though Megan's work history was a string of short-lived positions she left whenever she felt bored. I doubt they could tell anyone what I actually did. Sometimes I wondered if they even wanted to know. But the truth is, I had stopped asking for their interest long ago. The only person who genuinely understood was my best friend Julia. We met in college when we were both working part-time at the campus dining hall. She was the first person who ever noticed how my face tightened whenever someone mentioned family. She didn't push. She just let me speak when I was ready. Over the years, she learned every story, every disappointment, every moment that had shaped me. She celebrated my achievements louder than anyone, partly because she knew how rarely I had been celebrated as a child. She was the person who reminded me that distance from my family didn't make me heartless. It made me safe. She never told me to try harder with them the way some well-meaning people do. She understood that sometimes the healthiest thing a person can do is stop overreaching for people who never reach back. Still, I kept up polite contact. Short calls on holidays, the occasional visit when guilt crept in. I convinced myself it was enough, maybe even normal, and for a while my life felt stable, predictable, quiet in a way that seemed almost peaceful. If my relationship with my family was shallow, at least it was consistent. I had worked hard to build a grown woman's life instead of continuing the child's role they had handed me. I had responsibilities, clients, employees who relied on me. I had a routine that grounded me. Morning coffee, a walk to clear my head, a full day of meetings, evenings spent reading or planning or just sitting in silence with a scented candle burning on the counter. These were small things, but they were mine. They belonged to me. Looking back, the moment things began to shift wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday evening, the air cool from a late spring breeze drifting through the window. I had just finished reviewing a portfolio for a long-time client, a man in his 70s who trusted me with every penny he had. I remember feeling that quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. I remember putting my laptop aside, stretching my arms, and thinking about what I might cook for dinner. I remember feeling stable, steady, safe. That was when I saw the notification on my phone. At first, I didn't think much of it. My parents rarely emailed me unless it was some forwarded joke or a picture of Megan's newest accomplishment. But something about the subject line made me pause. It wasn't long, just my name followed by a period, as if the word itself was a weight. I told myself it was nothing. I opened it anyway. In that moment, all the calm I had cultivated over the years felt like it shifted just slightly, the way the earth trembles before anyone realizes an earthquake has begun. I didn't understand the full meaning of what I was reading yet. I only felt the old familiar tug in my chest, the one that whispered, "Here it is again." That old wound you thought had closed. Everything in my life up to that point had felt manageable. Even the distance from my family felt like something I could hold gently without bitterness. But as I read the email line by unsteady line, I realized I was stepping into a story I hadn't asked for, one that would pull me back into the very place I had spent years trying to outgrow. The email was simple, direct, and it carried the unmistakable sting of dismissal. I stared at the words, and all at once the past and present tangled together in a way that made it hard to breathe. Then an email from my parents changed everything. And it did, in the kind of quiet, sharp way that feels almost gentle at first, until the meaning settles in and you realize something inside you has shifted forever. When I opened that email, I was still sitting at my kitchen table, the late evening light washing across the wood in a soft gold. My laptop was closed, my stack of client files neatly arranged, and for once my mind felt calm. I had been thinking about making tea, maybe calling Julia to talk about her latest dating misadventure. I was at ease, safe, grounded in the small, carefully built routines of my adult life. But with a single click on my phone screen, that stability began to unravel. The email wasn't long, it wasn't emotional, it wasn't even thoughtful. It was exactly the kind of message someone might send when cancelling a dentist appointment or reminding you that trash pickup had moved to Friday. That was the part that stung first. The ease of it, the simplicity of pushing me aside. The message read, "Danielle, don't come to Megan's wedding. Just watch the live stream, okay? No greeting, no explanation, no softening. Just a line that told me the distance I had spent years creating had not only been noticed, but had been interpreted as something they could take advantage of." I stared at those words for a long moment, unsure whether to laugh or to feel the familiar squeeze in my chest. I read it again, hoping maybe I had missed something. I hadn't. There was a second line added almost as an afterthought. "It's for the best. Less stress for everyone. Less stress for everyone." As if my presence was a burden. As if the space I occupied in that family had always been too much. I could almost hear my mother's voice in the phrasing light and dismissive, delivering a request that sounded like kindness, but held the weight of a door being closed. I sat back in my chair, my phone still in my hand, and felt a strange mixture of calm and sting. The hurt wasn't sharp. It was familiar, almost worn down by the years of repetition. I had felt this before in the forgotten graduation, in the missed birthdays, in the quiet, tight smiles when Megan was praised and I was simply expected to understand why there was never quite enough affection left for me. It was the same old message wrapped in a new moment. You are less. You always have been. What surprised me most was how quickly the past resurfaced. Not in a dramatic wave, but in small flashes. The childhood afternoons spent quietly cleaning while Megan's smallest triumph was announced like breaking news. The nights I sat at the top of the stairs listening to my parents encourage Megan's dreams while mine were treated like hobbies I would eventually outgrow. The way my father always introduced Megan, proudly calling her my bright one, while I stood beside them waiting to hear what title he'd give me. He never found one. All of that flickered through me as I read the email, but this time something was different. I wasn't 12 years old, silently wishing I understood why love seemed to come in uneven portions. I wasn't 17, scanning an empty stadium seat, wondering if they had cars that broke down or simply forgot. I wasn't the young woman who once tried to earn her family's affection by being agreeable, helpful, quiet. I was 36. I owned a company that people trusted. I had responsibilities, a life built on my own terms, and a sense of self I had fought hard to grow. So instead of collapsing under the weight of old patterns, I found myself observing the pain rather than drowning in it. The hurt was real, yes, but it no longer defined me. It simply reminded me of who they still believed I was, someone I had long since outgrown. Still, even with that clarity, there was no denying the sting. Being excluded from a sister's wedding by your own parents isn't something a person can shrug off. It settles deep somewhere just beneath the ribs, in the place where old memories and present wounds meet. I took a slow breath and let it sit there, reminding myself that emotion doesn't make me weak. It makes me human. A part of me wondered why they felt the need to send an email at all. Why not call? Why not talk to me like they would talk to any other member of the family? The answer came easily: distance. Not the physical kind, but the emotional kind that had always lived between us. Email made it simpler, cleaner. They didn't have to hear the pause in my voice or risk any pushback. They never had to sit with the discomfort of seeing what their words did to me. I set down my phone and tried to imagine the conversation behind the email. I could picture Megan worrying that I would take attention away from her, though I had never once done anything to steal her spotlight. I could imagine my parents agreeing, telling her not to worry, that they would handle me, as if I were a loose thread that needed to be trimmed before the picture looked perfect. But the part that kept replaying in my mind wasn't the exclusion itself. It was the casual tone, the assumption that I would understand without question, that I would simply accept my position on the outskirts as I always had. I leaned back and let out a slow breath, thinking of Julia. She would be furious on my behalf more than I could ever be. She would tell me their behaviour was unacceptable, that no wedding justified treating a daughter like a nuisance. And she'd be right. But even in her outrage, she wouldn't fully grasp the way old wounds can make new ones feel inevitable. I stood up and walked to the window. The sky had deepened into a soft blue, and the street lights were flickering on one by one. For a moment, the world outside felt far more real than the one inside my phone. I needed air, so I stepped onto the small balcony outside my apartment. The evening breeze brushed my face, cool and steady. I closed my eyes and let it ground me. It wasn't that I wanted to go to the wedding. It was that I wanted the choice. I wanted to know that if I chose to show up, my presence wouldn't be treated like an inconvenience. After a few minutes, I returned inside calmer, but not numb. I picked up my phone again and read the email once more, just to be certain I hadn't misunderstood the tone. But it was as blunt as before. And this time, instead of asking what I had done wrong, I simply thought, "So this is how they still see me." I typed a reply. A simple line. "Sure, enjoy your big day." Before I could overthink it, I hit send. Then I placed my phone face down on the table and walked away, feeling something shift ever so slightly inside me. Not anger, not sadness, but a kind of quiet resolve. A clarity I hadn't expected. But what hurt wasn't the email. It was what followed. And that was true. The email had cut. But what happened after it was what opened the deeper wound. The one I didn't see coming. The one that didn't just sting, it revealed something far uglier beneath the surface. Something that made the air around me feel different, heavier, like a storm gathering behind calm skies. It happened less than 20 minutes after I sent my simple reply. I had just poured myself a glass of water, trying to settle my thoughts, when my phone buzzed again. I assumed it was my mother responding, or perhaps my father attempting a soft explanation. Instead, I saw Julia's name flash across the screen. She had sent not a message, but a string of images. Screenshots, dozens of them. I opened the first without thinking, expecting a meme or a photo from her latest cooking attempt. What I got instead was a conversation thread between two of my cousins. I felt my stomach tighten before I even understood what I was reading. One cousin wrote, "Well, Megan said, it was better if Danielle didn't show up. Less drama." Another responded, "Yeah," she said, "Danielle always ruins important moments. I didn't want to say anything, but maybe it's for the best." My eyes skimmed the lines again, making sure I wasn't misinterpreting. But there it was, in plain words, my sister painting me as the cause of trouble, a problem to be managed, someone to be kept out of sight so her day could shine. I tapped on the next screenshot. Another cousin chimed in. Megan said her fiancé doesn't want any tension. She said Danielle gets emotional and makes everyone uncomfortable. Yet another message followed. Honestly, if she's going to act like she did at that family gathering last fall, I don't blame her. I froze. Last fall. That gathering had been at my parents' house. I had spent most of the evening in the kitchen, helping my mother prep dishes while Megan circulated the room like a hostess. The only moment anyone might label as emotional was when I excused myself to take a call from a client who had unexpectedly lost her husband. I had stepped onto the porch to speak quietly and returned after composing myself. There had been no scene, no tears in front of any orange one, nothing dramatic. I had even carried in the dessert tray afterward. But now, that night had been rewritten into something shameful, something exaggerated to justify my absence. As I scrolled through the screenshots, a heaviness settled over me, not abrupt, but slow and steady, the way a shadow stretches across a room. These weren't just misunderstandings. These were stories. Stories Megan had told about me. Stories twisted into rumours, then softened into concerns, and finally shared among relatives as if they were unquestionable truth. Julia sent a final message beneath the screenshots. I didn't want to send these, but you need to see what's being said. I'm so sorry. The sympathy in her words cut deeper than the text in the images, not because she pitied me, but because she understood this wasn't just gossip. This was a rewriting of who I was. I sat down slowly, my knees feeling oddly unsteady. The room around me fell quiet in that way it does when your mind is making space for something painful. I read each message again, letting them settle so I wouldn't dismiss them as exaggerations. Megan had told people I ruined things, that I made events tense, that I was unpredictable, emotional, difficult. Words that did not belong to me, but were being attached to me like labels I had never worn, as if my very existence was a disruption. What struck me hardest wasn't the lies themselves, but how easily people believed them. How quickly they accepted Megan's version of me, without ever wondering if it matched the truth. I felt the old familiar ache rise, an ache born from years of being the quiet one, the dependable one, the one whose feelings were easy to overlook because I rarely voiced them. Megan's words filled the vacuum my silence had created. She crafted an image of me that suited her needs, and everyone around her accepted it because they had never bothered to see me clearly. I leaned forward and rested my elbows on the table, pressing my palms together for a moment. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't even hurt in the same way as before. This felt different. This felt like someone had taken something from me without my permission. Not my place at the wedding, but my dignity, my character. The version of me that I had worked hard to build quietly and without complaint had been overwritten by someone who barely understood the life I lived. As I sifted through the messages, I tried to understand the motive. Why would Megan do this? What did she gain by painting me as the villain of her life? The answer formed slowly the way a picture emerges in a dark room. Megan had always been the centre, the favoured one, the girl who got sympathy before anyone even asked why she needed it. And I had always been the opposite, the safe one to blame, the quiet one, to assume the one who wouldn't argue if attention shifted away from her. If she wanted a wedding day untouched by comparison or discomfort, then pushing me aside fit her pattern. She didn't want me there, not because I would ruin things, but because my presence reminded her of something she couldn't control. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was insecurity. Or maybe she simply wanted every spotlight to shine on her without having to share even the dust of it. It didn't matter which reason was true. What mattered was that she had chosen to twist the truth to protect her own image. I put down my phone and stared at the wall for a moment. I could feel something tightening inside me, not the kind of pain that melts into tears, but the kind that solidifies into steel. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a quiet shift, the kind that comes when a person reaches the end of tolerance and begins to see things with unmistakable clarity. I realised then that my parents' email had been just one piece of a larger picture. They hadn't excluded me because they didn't want family tension. They had excluded me because Megan had handed them a reason, a polished explanation crafted to make her seem blameless and me seem troublesome. She had given them a narrative that helped them keep the world arranged, worrying the way they preferred, simple, orderly, without having to examine their own part in the imbalance. For a moment, I wished I could say I was surprised, but the truth was, I had seen versions of this all my life. What was different now was the distance between who they believed me to be and who I had become. That distance had grown into a canyon, and I was no longer willing to pretend it didn't exist. As I sat there, I felt a steadiness grow in me. Not anger, not revenge, something firmer. A sense of self that had been shaped not by their treatment, but by everything I had built, despite their treatment. For the first time in a long while, I could feel a boundary forming clear, solid, and unmovable. I decided to answer in a very different way, and that was true. I just didn't know then how much those few simple words I was about to send would unsettle everything my family thought they understood about me. For most of my life, they believed they knew how I would respond to things quietly, politely, without protest. They had grown comfortable with the version of me who absorbed hurt like a sponge and kept the peace without ever asking for it in return. But that night, as I sat at my kitchen table, with those screenshots still open on my phone, something inside me shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even angry. It was a kind of clarity, a steadiness I hadn't felt before. The context I was standing in mattered. I was 36 years old. I ran a business people trusted. I lived alone in a space I built and paid for. I had spent years learning how to be grounded, how to be independent, how not to base my worth on a family that rarely saw me. Yet, here I was again reading cruel little sentences written by people who barely knew me anymore. Sentences spoken by a sister who had always controlled the story of who I was. But this time, the weight of it didn't crush me. It clarified me. I picked up my phone and opened the email from my parents once more. The message looked even more hollow now that I understood the foundation beneath it. It wasn't concern. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the rotten fruit of a story Megan had crafted, about me, one they had believed without question. I read the line again. Don't come to Megan's wedding. Just watch the live stream, okay? The casual tone no longer pierced me the way it might have a few years ago. Now it simply told me who they still believed I was. It told me they expected silence from me, not strength. I let out a slow breath and clicked reply. For a moment, my fingers hovered above the screen, not from uncertainty, but from intention. I wanted to choose the exact right words, the ones that revealed nothing of the hurt, nothing of the shock, nothing of the truth I had just uncovered. I wanted them to read my response and assume, just as they always had, that I was conceding, stepping aside, making myself small for their comfort. So I typed, "Sure, enjoy your big day." 7 words, light, polite, without a trace of the storm forming beneath them. Words that sounded like acceptance but came from a place of strength. I read them once more, made sure they were calm and unthreatening, then hit send before I could be questioned by the part of myself that still flinched around my family. The moment the message left my phone, I felt a surprising stillness settle over me. There was no anxiety, no regret, just the quiet sense that a door I had been leaning against for years had finally clicked shut behind me. They would think I was stepping back. They would think I was yielding. They would think, as always, that I had folded. But they were wrong. For once, my silence did not come from fear. It came from choice. A clear, deliberate choice to no longer beg for space that should have always been mine. A choice to no longer correct their assumptions or fight for the smallest bit of recognition. I had spent years watching them shape their version of me, and I had let them do it because I thought staying quiet kept the peace. But now, I could see that peace built on my silence was not peace at all. It was erasure. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair. The room was dim except for the warm light above the stove. I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator, the quiet settling of the building around me, the distant sound of a car driving down the street. Everything felt strangely calm. I didn't pace. I didn't overthink. I simply sat there for a while, letting the stillness hold me. It was the kind of stillness that grows not out of resignation, but resolve. After a few minutes, I picked up the glass of water I'd poured earlier and took a slow sip. The coolness settled inside me, grounding me. My mind drifted to the years behind me, years filled with moments when I had swallowed what I wanted to say. The small humiliations I had brushed aside. The birthdays spent waiting for a call that never came. The times I tried to share good news only to hear, "That's nice," before the conversation shifted back to Megan. All of it accumulated quietly, shaping a woman who learned to hold her breath around her own family. But tonight, I exhaled. I thought about Julia and how she would react when I told her everything. She would insist that my response was far too polite. She would want something sharper, something that matched the cruelty of the things I'd read. But I didn't need sharpness to feel strong. I didn't need to lash out to feel powerful. My strength didn't look like confrontation. It looked like clarity. It looked like choosing myself. I decided not to call her, at least not that night. I wanted to sit with the feeling, understand it before sharing it out loud. I walked to the living room and turned on a lamp, letting the soft glow fill the space. I curled up on the couch with a blanket and just stayed there for a while, thinking about the years of being overlooked and the strange relief of no longer needing to fight for approval. It wasn't that I didn't care. It wasn't that I didn't feel the sting. It was that I finally understood the sting wasn't mine to fix. I had spent too long believing that if I tried harder, acted better, stayed quieter, they would one day see me the way I yearned to be seen. But tonight, I realized that recognition was never coming from them. And for the first time, that realization didn't break me. It freed me. It must have been close to midnight when I finally stood and turned off the lights. The air felt a little lighter, the way it does after you decide something important. I climbed into bed not with heaviness, but with a sense of finality. My last thought before sleep was simple. I am done shrinking. By morning, I expected the silence to continue. I expected the usual pattern, the message sent, the decision made, the distance maintained. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, I woke to my phone vibrating non-stop on the nightstand. Call after call. Message after message. All from the same people who had so confidently dismissed me the night before. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. And that is exactly how it began, before the sun had even settled fully over the horizon, before I had time to understand what day it was, before my thoughts had caught up with my waking body. My phone buzzed relentlessly on the nightstand like an alarm I hadn't set. For a moment, I lay still, staring at the ceiling, letting the sound fill the room before I reached for it. I didn't feel panicked or hurried. I felt something closer to curiosity, sharpened by the calm clarity I'd found the night before. Whatever waited inside those missed calls didn't scare me. It simply asked to be understood. When I finally picked up the phone, the screen showed a long list of missed calls: my mother, my father, the house phone at my parents' place, and even numbers I barely recognised but knew belonged to relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. or within an hour. The sight of it would have rattled me in the past, but instead, I felt a strange separation, as if I were looking at someone else's crisis. Before I listened to any of the messages, I sat up, pulled my hair back, and let the quiet morning settle around me. I wanted to hear their voices with a clear mind, not with the remnants of sleep fogging my judgment. My apartment felt steady, like it held its own boundaries against the panic coming through the phone. I took a sip of water, rested my feet on the floor, and then pressed play on the first voicemail. My mother's voice filled the room, immediately trembling in a way I hadn't heard since I was a child. "Danielle, honey, please call us when you get this. It's important." Her tone had none of the casual dismissiveness from the email. It carried urgency, the kind that comes when something has slipped out of someone's control. I deleted it without responding. The next message was from my father. His voice was tight, the way it gets when he's trying to sound calm, but has no idea what to say. "We need to talk, Danielle. Please, call back." No explanation, no acknowledgement of the hurtful email, just a command disguised as concern. Then came one from the house line. My mother again, this time speaking faster, her breath catching. "Megan cried all night. She said, you sent an email and then nothing, and now she's upset and we don't know what to tell her. Just call us, please." I paused the playback. "Cried all night." I let those words sit between my ribs for a moment. Beneath them, something didn't fit. Megan was not someone who cried easily, and certainly not because I had politely stepped aside the way they claimed they wanted. If anything, my cooperation should have made her wedding planning easier. But instead, she cried all night. The inconsistency was unmistakable, and it cut through the fog of emotion with crisp precision. Something else was happening, something deeper than offended feelings or last-minute nerves. I played the next few messages, each one carrying more urgency than the last. A cousin asking if I was all right. Another relative I barely knew telling me to give your mother a call, sweetheart. Even one from an aunt I hadn't spoken to since my early 20s, saying she hoped everything was okay. The concern was overwhelming and strangely sudden. None of these people had tried to reach me in months, some in years. Yet now they all wanted to hear my voice within a matter of minutes. This wasn't about me being absent from a wedding. This was fear. Something had frightened them. As the messages continued, I felt an unusual calm settle over me. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't upset. I wasn't rushing to hit return call the way I once might have done in my 20s, eager to smooth things over and restore peace I never created. Instead, I felt like someone standing at the edge of a foggy field, feeling the shape of something moving inside it. Not threatening, but unknown. I sat for a moment, the phone warm in my hand, and thought about everything leading up to this point. The email, the screenshots, the lies Megan told, the years I'd been cast in roles I never chose. For the first time, I felt the imbalance shift. They wanted something from me now. They needed something. And for once, I had no inclination to give it freely. Not until I understood what had truly set off this flurry of calls. I stood and walked to the kitchen, letting the coffee maker hum while I replayed the final voicemail. It was my mother again, her voice more fragile than before. "Danielle, we didn't think you'd take it this way. Please call us. It's gotten complicated." The word complicated hung in the air like smoke. I turned off the voicemail and leaned against the counter, coffee warming my hands. Complicated meant something had broken. Not the wedding plans, not the feelings. Something in the narrative. Something in the story Megan had spun. For years, Megan had told people I was unstable, emotional, difficult. And now, here I was, calm and silent, giving them no reaction to hold against me. In their eyes, I had stepped neatly into the distance they assigned me, and somehow that had rattled them more than any protest could have. I walked to the window, watching the quiet street below as the morning light sharpened. Why were they so desperate for me to respond? What had Megan said about me to make my silence dangerous? The question sharpened my senses, drawing me away from hurt and toward curiosity. This wasn't about exclusion anymore. It was about something they feared I had discovered or would discover soon. The phone rang again, buzzing on the counter so insistently that I turned it face down. I knew the calls would continue until someone reached me, but I felt no urgency to make myself available. I poured my coffee, let the steam warm my face, and moved to the couch. I needed space to think, to sift through what I knew, to prepare for whatever was coming next. While I sat there, another message came through. This time a text from an aunt I had spoken to maybe twice in the past decade. Her name flashing across my phone startled me more than the earlier calls. She was not someone who usually involved herself in family matters unless things had already spiraled beyond control. Her message read, "Please call me. I know what's going on." My heart gave one slow measured thump. Not panic, not fear, just recognition. This was the thing I'd been waiting for, the thread that would pull everything into focus. Someone finally willing to break the silence that had shaped my entire childhood. Someone ready to say what my parents would not. I picked up the phone gently, almost reverently, realizing the moment was bigger than the wedding, bigger than the email, bigger even than the lies Megan had spread. It was tied to something older, something buried within the dynamics of our family, long before this wedding ever existed. I sat up straighter the morning, suddenly feeling charged, and opened the message thread. Then an aunt finally told me the truth. And when I pressed call on her number, I had no idea how deeply that truth would reach, or how quickly it would turn everything I thought I understood about the situation into something much darker, much heavier, and far more dangerous than hurt feelings or family favoritism. At this point, I was steady. My morning coffee sat cooling beside me, the unanswered messages from my parents were still piling up, and the confusion that had hung in the air earlier was slowly giving way to something clearer, sharper. I had spent most of my life assuming that when something went wrong within my family, the cause eventually pointed back at me, or at least that was how they framed it. But today felt different. There was a hum under the surface, a sense that I had been pulled into a story that had nothing to do with my personality, my childhood, or even my relationship with Megan. This was bigger, and I could feel it in the way my aunt answered the phone. She didn't start with pleasantries, she didn't ask how I was or comment on the weather. She said, before anything else, "Danielle, I need you to listen to me before you call anyone back." Her voice wasn't sharp, but firm, grounded in a seriousness she rarely showed. This was the aunt who usually sent Christmas cards with glitter and stories about her garden. But today, she sounded like someone standing on the edge of a secret she wished she didn't have to carry. I swallowed, sat up straighter, and said quietly, "I'm listening." There was a long pause on her end, long enough that I wondered if she was deciding whether to speak at all. Then she said, "Your sister didn't want you at that wedding, Danielle." And it wasn't because of the things she said. I felt a small pulse of bitterness rise. Of course, it wasn't because of the lies about drama and tension. That part I already guessed. But the weight in my aunt's tone warned me that this wasn't about jealousy or old habits of exclusion. This was something else entirely. "She's scared you'll see someone there," my aunt went on. "Someone who knows the groom. Someone who could talk to you." The air in the room seemed to shift. "What do you mean, talk to me?" Another pause. "There's a man, well, several, I think, people the groom used to work with or owe money to. I don't know the full story. But your sister's been terrified that you'd hear things if you went. She said it once at a family dinner when she thought no one was listening. She said you pick up on things and that you'd put pieces together." Her words settled over me like dust after a collapse. My heart didn't race. It stayed calm, almost too calm in that way it does when you finally understand why all the strange pieces in front of you fit together so uneasily. What pieces, I asked quietly. My aunt exhaled. "Danielle, his past isn't clean. He owes money to who I don't know. But I heard your mother whispering about it weeks ago. Something about old debts and bad decisions. Something about people calling the house and then pretending it was a wrong number. And Megan, she knows. Or at least suspects. She's been different, nervous, jumping at the smallest things. As she spoke, the shape of the puzzle sharpened in my mind. This wasn't about me at all. This wasn't about keeping the peace or avoiding tension. This was fear. Not fear of my presence, but fear of exposure. Fear that I would recognize someone. Fear that someone would recognize me. Fear that I would start asking questions only I knew how to ask. My aunt kept talking, her voice softening. Your sister didn't want to admit it. She said you'd make things complicated. But I think, deep down, she's afraid for herself. Afraid that if you started digging, you'd find something she's been trying very hard not to see. I sat very still listening to her words, feeling the truth settle like a coin dropping into its final slot. Megan had built her life around image, around validation, around being adored. If she sensed even a whisper of a crack in the perfect picture she wanted for her wedding day, she would do anything to protect it, even if it meant pushing away the one person who might actually help her. Why me? I asked, though. The answer was already forming in my mind. Why not keep other people away? My aunt hesitated, then said carefully, because you're the one who notices things, Danielle. You always have. You're the one who reads the fine print, the one who listens between the lines. Even as a child, you understood things the rest of us overlooked. Your sister is afraid you'll see something she can't explain away. Her words felt like both a compliment and a burden. All my life I had been told I was too quiet, too thoughtful, too observant, as if those qualities were flaws. But here in this moment, they were exactly the reason Megan had wanted me gone. I leaned back against the couch. Do you know anything else about him? I asked. No, my aunt said softly. But I know this. The way your parents reacted this morning, the way they rushed to get ahead of whatever they think might happen, it tells me they know enough to be worried. I rubbed my forehead, processing. For years I had assumed my place in the family was determined by old dynamics, favoritism, patterns, habits. No one wanted to break. But now I could see it clearly. I had been excluded. Not because I was unwanted, but because I was dangerous in the eyes of the story Megan needed to preserve. So she lied about me to everyone, I said quietly, just to keep me from hearing something about him. Yes, my aunt replied. She's protecting him. Or protecting herself, maybe both. The sadness in her voice wasn't for me. It was for Megan. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. My hurt shifted into something more grounded, a resolve, a calmness with shape and purpose. The landscape of the situation had changed entirely. This wasn't sibling rivalry. This wasn't petty cruelty. This wasn't the old family imbalance repeating itself. This was a warning, a sign that something beneath the surface was beginning to break open. My aunt's last words were almost a whisper. Be careful, Danielle. Something about this doesn't feel right. After we hung up, I sat staring at the blank television screen in front of me. My heart moved with quiet, steady certainty. I wasn't just dealing with a wedding exclusion anymore. I was dealing with a man whose past had shadows. A sister who was caught somewhere between denial and fear. Parents who were panicking because the version of the story they had repeated wasn't holding anymore. For the first time since the email arrived, I felt fully awake. If this groom had a past he wanted to bury, and if Megan knew even a fraction of it, then everything made sense. The lies, the urgency, the sudden flood of messages. And if the people he owed money to or lied to were going to be at the wedding, then they were the key. Not gossip, not emotion, not family drama. Facts. I stood and walked to my desk. If there was one thing I understood better than anyone else in my family, it was patterns, discrepancies, inconsistencies, truth hiding in paper trails. I needed proof, real proof. And that sentence stayed with me like a steady pulse as I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The morning light had stretched fully across my apartment by then, warming the room but not touching the cold focus settling inside me. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't panicked. I moved with the kind of clarity that only comes when a person finally understands the shape of the danger they're facing. My aunt's warning had peeled back the top layer of whatever Megan was caught up in, but it was up to me to see what lay underneath. I began by opening the folder system, where I kept records of old clients and consultations. Over the years, people had come to me with all kinds of financial worries, lost documents, confusing contracts, strange withdrawals they couldn't explain. I saved everything. Not because I expected to need it one day, but because I was the kind of person who held on to details. It was a habit formed in childhood when details were the only way to make sense of things no one explained. Now, those details might save my sister's life. I typed the groom's name into the search bar. For a long moment, nothing appeared. I wondered if maybe my aunt had been mistaken, or if the man's past was hidden deeper than I had access to. But then, after a few seconds, a single file popped up, one I hadn't looked at in years. It belonged to a woman named Mrs. Calloway, a widow in her 70s, who had once asked me to help her sort through a series of troubling financial documents. She had suspected her son-in-law of mishandling some of her accounts, but buried in her paperwork had been an unrelated complaint involving a man she referred to as the young advisor, who visited me and then vanished. I clicked the file open, my breath tightening as the scanned pages loaded. There it was, his name. Not just the name he used publicly, but the full legal version of it typed by her in shaky capital letters. She had written that he approached her about a small investment opportunity, urged her to move money into an account he opened for her, and then disappeared before she could ask any questions. She hadn't lost her entire savings, but she lost enough that it frightened her. At the time, I had encouraged her to file a formal complaint, but she had been embarrassed. She didn't want her family to see the mistake she had made. Seeing his name there now made something inside me go cold. This wasn't vague rumour or family gossip. This was documented history from someone I had spoken to, someone I trusted. It was evidence that the man about to marry my sister was not simply careless or unlucky. He had taken money from an elderly woman, lied to her, and then disappeared. I scrolled through the notes I had made during that meeting. I had written down his mannerisms, the type of documents he had used, even the way he had pressured her into signing quickly. I remembered thinking at the time that he seemed too polished, too eager. I had felt something off in the way Mrs. Calloway described him, but I hadn't pursued it because she wanted the matter dropped. Now it was back in my hands, no longer dormant. My heart tightened, not with fear, but with a grim understanding. This wasn't just about money. This was about patterns. People who deceive the elderly rarely change their habits. They just get better at hiding them. I took a breath and reached for my phone. There was only one person I knew who might have seen this man's face somewhere else, someone from my old job back before I opened my own firm. A colleague named Tim, who had worked in compliance and kept track of people moving in and out of the industry. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but if anyone could confirm the whispers my aunt had hinted at, it was him. I found his number and pressed call. He answered on the third ring, sounding surprised, but friendly. After a few polite words, I explained what I had found. Then I gave him the groom's name. The silence on the other end wasn't long, but it was heavy. Danielle, he said slowly. Where did you hear that name? His voice had changed. It wasn't casual anymore. It was careful. My sister is marrying him, I said, this weekend. Another silence, sharper this time. Then, you're kidding. Right, no, I said quietly. He exhaled. I don't know everything, but I know enough to say this. He left his last firm under bad circumstances. There were reports that he borrowed money from clients. One guy from our team tried to follow up, but the trail went cold. He had already left the state. My pulse steadied, even as the air around me seemed to shift. Borrowed money, I repeated. From clients. Tim hesitated. That's the polite way of saying it. He left people in a bad place. There was talk that someone tried to confront him, But by then, he was already working under a different business name. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what I was hearing. So, if this is the same man I said he has a pattern Tim agreed, and not the kind that ends well. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I felt something cold move through me, not fear for myself, but fear for Megan. I thought of my aunt's warning, my parents' panic, the sudden rush of calls that morning. They hadn't been afraid of me causing drama. They had been afraid of me uncovering what their soon-to-be son-in-law did not want seen. Tim cleared his throat. Danielle, does your sister know any of this? I don't think so, I said softly. But she knows enough to be afraid. He let out a long breath. If I were you, I'd tread carefully. Men like him don't leave clean histories behind. I know, I said, that's why I'm calling. He paused. If you want, I can try to find more. But be prepared. It's not pretty. We exchanged a few more words, then hung up. I sat back in my chair, feeling the truth settle in layers. My sister was about to marry a man who had lied to vulnerable people, taken their money, and vanished. A man whose past was already catching up to him. A man who had reasons to keep certain faces away from his wedding. And I was one of those faces. I looked at the file still open on my screen, at the shaky handwriting of the woman he had deceived. Something about the way she wrote his name tugged at a memory I couldn't quite place. Something familiar in the dates, the pattern of behaviour, the way he moved from place to place. I scrolled deeper into my records, searching for anything that might connect the dots. And then I found something even worse. That sentence echoed in my mind as I clicked through my archived folders, a part of me bracing for what I might uncover next. I had already found enough to worry me: a record of deception, financial harm, and a pattern of disappearing before consequences could catch up. But the uneasy feeling growing in my chest told me I hadn't reached the heart of it yet. There was something deeper, something I had almost forgotten existed, tucked away in the corners of my work from years ago. At this point, my entire understanding of the situation had shifted. This was no longer about being excluded from Megan's wedding. It wasn't even about Megan's insecurity or my family's unfairness. It was about a man with a dangerous history and a sister who, for reasons I still didn't fully understand, had gotten tangled in his web. My state of mind had sharpened into a rare clarity. The hurt was still there, but it had settled beneath a stronger instinct, the need to protect not through emotion but through truth. I opened the oldest section of my records, the ones I rarely touched anymore. They contained cases from the early years when I was still learning how to navigate the world of financial consulting, when I took on clients who needed someone to listen more than someone to advise. Those early files were filled with handwritten notes, scanned letters, and details I hadn't thought about in a long time. My breath caught when I clicked on one particular folder labelled Irregular Cases, First Year. I opened it not because I expected to find anything familiar, but because something in me felt drawn to it, as if a part of my memory had been nudged awake. Inside the folder were several documents, some typed, some scanned, but one file in particular stood out. A scan of a folded letter written in careful, deliberate handwriting. For a moment, I couldn't place it. Then I opened it and felt the recognition wash over me in a slow, chilling wave. It was from Mrs. Calloway, the same elderly woman whose case I had revisited only minutes earlier. But this wasn't the set of notes from our meeting. This was the actual letter she had mailed to the company he worked for, at the time pleading for answers after her money had disappeared. She had given it to me during our consultation, asking if I could help her understand it or forward it to someone who could take action. I remembered now. I had scanned it just in case, thinking one day she might change her mind and pursue the matter formally. Then she decided to let it go, telling me she was too embarrassed to cause trouble. And I, respecting her wishes, kept the letter but never acted on it. Now it stared back at me like a warning from the past I should have paid more attention to. The letter was addressed to his firm's compliance department, and at the bottom, stamped across her closing paragraph in blue ink, was a signature. His signature. The groom's name, written in a quick practice flourish I recognized instantly after seeing it earlier that morning. And beneath his signature was a handwritten note, matter resolved. But it hadn't been resolved. The amount she listed, just over $7,000, had never been returned to her. She had confirmed that to me herself. She had simply chosen not to fight it. My fingers tightened around the mouse. I scanned the letter twice, 3 times, reading each line with growing heaviness. The signature wasn't just a scribbled name. It was proof. Proof that he had acknowledged her complaint. Proof that he had dismissed it. Proof that he had knowingly taken her money and marked the matter closed to avoid consequences. This single sheet of paper could unravel everything he had built since then. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't rumour. It was documented, dated evidence tied directly to his actions. If I took this letter to the right place, his current employer, the authorities, even the venue hosting the wedding, the entire event could be halted in an instant. The realization settled heavily on me. This was no longer a choice about attending or not attending. This was a crossroads. One document, one decision could change the entire trajectory of Megan's life and mine. I sat back, letting the weight of it sit in my chest. I wasn't impulsive by nature. I had built my life around careful thought, around understanding consequences, around respecting the boundaries of other people's choices. If I stepped forward with this information, everything would explode: Megan's wedding, her relationship, our family dynamics. There would be no going back from it. But if I stayed silent, I knew what would happen. Megan would marry a man with a history of deception and financial manipulation. She would tie herself legally and emotionally to someone who had never shown remorse for the harm he'd caused. And the next time he took something from someone, that harm might reach her directly. My hand rested lightly on the edge of the desk as I breathed in slowly. I could feel the moment settling into my bones. This was the point where everything shifted. This was the moment I had been walking toward without realizing it. Every hurt, every dismissal, every quiet decision I had made in the shadows of my family dynamics had brought me here. And now I had to choose whether I would remain the invisible daughter or become something else entirely, someone who stood in the path of danger, even when the person she was protecting had pushed her away. I thought of Megan's voice, the way she used to confide in me when we were little, back before life took us in different directions. I thought of the lies she had told about me, the cruel gossip she had repeated, and for the first time, I saw all of it for what it really was, not a personal attack, but the behaviour of someone who was scared, deeply, quietly scared. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of what I might find. I looked at the letter again. The signature stared back at me, crisp and undeniable. And beneath it, those 2 chilling words, matter resolved. My heartbeat slowed. My hands steadied. This document wasn't just evidence. It was truth. And truth has a way of reshaping everything it touches. I wasn't sure yet whether I would use it, or how, or when. But I knew this much: I wasn't going to stand by and watch my sister walk into a life built on lies. I saved the file to a secure folder, printed a copy for safekeeping, and placed it gently inside a drawer by my desk. My mind was still processing the magnitude of the discovery when my phone buzzed. Once, twice. Then again, quick and sharp, cutting through the quiet of the room. The sound felt different this time, urgent, invasive, almost menacing. I reached for it, feeling a chill move through me. Just then, a threatening message appeared on my phone, and for a moment I simply stared at the screen. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. It felt unreal, the way quiet danger often does, not loud or dramatic, but cold and deliberate, sliding into the room without knocking. I had expected tension from my family, confusion from relatives, maybe even a meltdown from Megan. a threat. That was different. That was a line being crossed. The message came from an unknown number. No name, no hint of its origin. Just one sentence sitting starkly against the white screen. Stay out of the wedding. It'll be better for everyone. The words were simple enough, even polite, if someone didn't look closely. But I did. And I knew instantly who had sent it. I had heard his tone before, not directly, but in the way people described him. In the abruptness buried under forced charm, the pressure disguised as suggestion. There was something manufactured in the wording, as if he had tried to soften the threat, but couldn't quite hide the edge beneath it. I sat back slowly, letting the phone rest against my palm. My apartment was quiet in that moment, too quiet, almost as if it were listening. The late afternoon light touched my desk, the printed copy of the letter still tucked inside the drawer. On my laptop, the scanned image of his signature remained open on the screen, undeniable and incriminating. He knew. Somehow, in the space of a few hours, the groom had realised I was digging. Maybe Megan had sensed my shift and mentioned it. Maybe my parents had panicked loud enough for him to overhear. Or maybe he simply understood how people like me operated. Men with secrets often know exactly who can expose them. They have a sixth sense for danger, the kind that doesn't come from force, but from quiet, methodical clarity. I read the message again. Stay out of the wedding. It'll be better for everyone. Better for him, certainly. But better for everyone, no. Not for Megan. Not for the family being manipulated without even realising it. And not for the people he had already harmed and left behind. I placed the phone on the table and closed my eyes for a moment, letting my mind settle. My instinct wasn't to panic, though a small, cold thread moved along my spine. Instead, I felt something firmer, steadier, almost anchored. I had lived a life of being underestimated. I had been treated as soft, quiet, safe to ignore. But beneath that quiet lived a truth I had learned through years of surviving my own family's blind spots. Stillness was not weakness, it was patience. And patience had its breaking point. This person about to marry my sister, had just told me exactly how much he feared what I knew. And fear reveals the truth faster than any investigation. I picked up the phone again and studied the number. I didn't call it back. That would have been useless. Men like him don't answer direct confrontation unless they think they can manipulate the outcome. No, this required something different. Something I had spent years mastering without ever intending to restraint. I typed a short reply. Just 2 words. Noted. Thanks. Then I sent it. It was the same strategy I had used with my parents, give them calmness where they expected conflict politeness, where they anticipated panic. Let them believe they still held the narrative. People who rely on manipulation always unravel when the reaction they expect doesn't arrive. They lose their footing. They make mistakes. My message wasn't compliance. It was bait. After sending it, I slipped the phone into my robe pocket and walked to the window. The neighbourhood outside was quiet the afternoon, holding on to the last of the day's light. I watched a couple walking their dog, an older man sweeping his porch, a child riding a bike with one training wheel slightly crooked. Ordinary life. A world moving on as if nothing dangerous had entered mine. But danger had entered. It was subtle but no less real. And I understood something in that moment. The threat meant I was right. It meant I had touched the truth he wanted buried. It meant I wasn't imagining the danger my aunt had whispered about. It meant Megan wasn't just marrying a man with a messy past. She was marrying someone who felt desperate enough to silence the one person capable of pulling the rug out from under him. A faint unease rose in me, not for my safety, but for Megan's. If he was willing to threaten me before the wedding, what would he be willing to do after the vows were spoken, and she was legally bound to him? What debts would become hers? What lies would she be forced to defend? What consequences would she carry for him? As I stared out at the street, I realised how deeply I did not want those answers to become her future. I turned from the window and sat back down at my desk, pulling the printed letter from the drawer. I held it between my fingers, feeling the weight of the thin paper. It was astonishing, really, how something so light could carry the force to shatter an entire wedding. It wasn't just a document, it was leverage, truth, proof of the kind that doesn't bend under pressure. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt responsible. I wasn't the kind of person who used information to destroy people. I wasn't vindictive. I wasn't seeking revenge against my sister despite what she had said and done. If anything, the pain she caused me made it harder, not easier to accept that she was walking straight into danger. But the truth doesn't wait for emotional readiness. It demands to be faced. My phone buzzed again. Another message from an unknown number, but the tone of this one was different. More frantic, shorter. "Drop it. I'm serious." The shift was telling. He had realised I wasn't intimidated. I did not reply. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the table and leaned back, slowly, letting my breath settle. A strange clarity filled me, the kind that doesn't come often, but arrives decisively when it does. I wasn't backing down, not from him, not from the truth, not from the responsibility of protecting someone who had spent years misunderstanding me. If he thought I would disappear quietly, he had misunderstood the kind of woman I had become. Silence had been my survival mechanism, not my identity. I stood, made myself a cup of tea, and let the steam warm my hands. And somewhere in the quiet of my kitchen, I sensed that a new shift was beginning, not just from him, but from the family who had started this mess, without understanding what they were doing. Because the groom wasn't the only one sensing the ground move beneath him. And my family began sensing something was wrong too. And by the time I set my tea aside and tried to steady myself for whatever would come next, I could feel those ripples reaching beyond me. Panic had begun to shift through my family in ways I couldn't fully see yet, but I sensed it, something loosening, something cracking open, something they had worked hard to keep contained. I didn't know the specifics of what my parents had discovered, or what they were whispering about in their house miles away, but I could imagine the unease settling in. They had always held on to their version of the world, tightly arranging it, so Megan stayed at the centre, and I stayed somewhere safely out of the frame. But now, even from a distance, I could feel the pattern slipping. When families rely on routines of silence and assumption, any disruption, especially one as subtle as mine, feels like an earthquake. Later that evening, when the phone finally stopped buzzing and I allowed myself a moment to breathe, I thought about my mother. She was a woman who lived inside her own narratives, choosing order over truth whenever possible. But even she had limits. Even she could not ignore the tension that was likely unravelling inside her home that very moment. She wasn't a cruel person. She was a person who needed things to make sense. And someone in that house had started acting in ways she could no longer explain. I didn't hear the details until later, but my mother's doubt had begun quietly that morning, long before she left those voicemails on my phone. While my family was preparing for the wedding, she had gone into the dining room to double-check the seating chart. Something she loved doing, fussing over where people sat as if harmony could be arranged with name cards. She noticed the printed list didn't match the one she had helped create earlier in the week. Names had been shifted around, 3 tables reorganised, and, most notably, mine had vanished entirely. Not a cross-out, not a correction note, not even a margin mark. It was as if I had never been invited at all. I could imagine how she stood there, blinking at the chart, trying to convince herself she had made an error. She likely fetched the original list from her folder, laying them side by side, as if comparing 2 versions of a map. She would have traced my name with her finger, found the place where it once sat near the back, not an honoured seat, but a place at least, and then looked at the new version where the space had been repurposed, filled with someone else's name, as if I didn't belong. That kind of erasure, even for someone who had practiced overlooking me for years, must have felt jarring. But what unsettled her more came next. She walked down the hallway toward Megan's room, probably intending to ask her about the chart. Maybe she planned to suggest adding me back, or at least question the messy adjustment. But before she reached the door, She heard Megan's voice, not the smooth, bright voice she used around the family, but a sharp, frightened one. It stopped my mother where she stood. I didn't have to be there to picture it. Megan's door slightly cracked, the sound of her breath hitching the tone of someone who had been crying for far too long. My mother, cautious, leaning in without meaning to eavesdrop, but unable to walk away. Inside, Megan was whispering urgently, her voice shaking. "You promised it wouldn't be a problem," she said. "You said she wouldn't be there." My mother likely froze. She had probably never heard Megan sound that hollowed out with fear. Then came the groom's voice, low and tense. "She won't be. I took care of it." Those words, simple as they were, must have pierced something in my mother. After all, she had raised us. She knew the tone of fear in her daughter's voice, even if she had never chosen to see it before. And she recognised something else too, a man speaking not with reassurance, but with frustration, maybe even anger. The kind that doesn't belong inside a conversation about a wedding guest. My mother must have inched closer, barely breathing, because what came next was the part she repeated under her breath in one of her voicemails. Megan cried all night. And in that whispered argument, Megan said something that shattered whatever story my mother had been telling herself. "If she shows up, he'll be furious," Megan whispered. "Please, I can't handle that right now. Not upset, not nervous, not embarrassed. Furious." That single word carried centuries of warning for any woman willing to hear it. And whether my mother wanted to or not, she heard it. Megan wasn't afraid of me showing up because of old sibling tension. She wasn't afraid of drama. She wasn't afraid of attention shifting away from her. She was afraid of him. At that moment, the lifetime of favoritism, the constant leaning toward Megan, the excusing of her decisions, the way my parents always reinforced her as the cherished daughter, began to tremble. Because my mother finally recognized something I had known for years. Fear doesn't lie. It doesn't dress itself up in polite explanations. It doesn't pretend everything is fine. Megan was terrified. My mother stepped back slowly from the door, unsure whether she was witnessing something private or something dangerous. She would have walked to the kitchen, her mind racing, searching for a place to put this new information. People like my mother don't leap to conclusions. They circle them, cautiously testing every corner for the story that fits. And nothing about this fit. She looked again at the altered guest list, at the empty space where my name had been, at the edits written not in her handwriting but in his. It must have been the first time in her life that she questioned whether Megan had misled her, whether she herself had contributed to something harmful without realising it, whether the decision to send me that cold, dismissive email had been pushed from someone else's fear rather than her own. My mother was not used to doubt. She had spent decades trusting Megan without question. But trust has a fragile seam, and she had heard it tear. She picked up the phone to call me again, her hands unsteady, her thoughts spiralling. Perhaps she hoped to ask me something she didn't know how to voice. Perhaps she simply needed to hear my voice to steady herself. Or maybe, just maybe, she wanted to say she was wrong. But I didn't answer. And that silence created a space wide enough for all her questions to fill. Later that night, long after I had stopped listening to the voicemails, long after I had grown quiet in my living room with the truth sitting beside me, I walked toward my apartment door to pick up a grocery delivery I had ordered earlier. When I opened the door, there was no bag of groceries yet. But resting on the floor, propped neatly against the door frame, was a single handwritten letter addressed to me in a familiar script. Then I received a handwritten letter, and as I bent down to pick up that envelope, a strange stillness filled the hallway outside my apartment. It was the kind of quiet that feels intentional, as though the world is pausing to let something important happen. The envelope was cream-coloured, slightly textured, and addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Delicate, slanted, familiar in a way that tightened my throat before I even broke the seal. It was my grandfather's handwriting. I stepped back inside, closed the door gently behind me, and held the letter for a long moment before I opened it. At this point in the story, after everything I had discovered about the groom, after the threat on my phone, after sensing my family's fear wrapping tighter by the hour, my mind was a mix of clarity and tension. I felt steady, determined, watchful. But seeing that handwriting stirred something softer, something I hadn't expected, a sense of being seen. My grandfather had always been the quiet observer at family gatherings. He was never loud, never forceful. He sat in his favourite chair and watched the room with eyes far sharper than people gave him credit for. As a child, I'd sometimes catch him watching me with a kind of gentle sadness, but neither of us ever named it. And now, after all these years, he had decided to write to me. That alone felt significant. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single page written in blue ink. His handwriting trembled slightly, age edging into the loops and lines, but the words were clear. "Dear Danielle," it began, "I am writing this because I am not sure anyone else in this family will tell you the truth." I sank onto the couch, the letter trembling faintly in my hands. "I have watched you since you were a little girl," he wrote, "and I have watched the way you were treated. I saw the moments they overlooked you, the moments they expected more from you than they should have, and the moments they excused Megan without question. I should have spoken up long ago. I didn't. And I am sorry." I closed my eyes, letting the words settle. It was the first time, truly the first time in my life, that someone from my family acknowledged what I had lived through. Not imagined, not exaggerated, real. "I want you to know," he continued, "that it was never because you lacked anything. You were the steady one, the thoughtful one, the one who tried to keep peace even when it cost you something, and the family took advantage of that more often than they realised." My breath caught. He saw it. All those years he saw it. But the next paragraph struck deeper, cutting into a place I had long covered with silence. "There is something else I must tell you," he wrote. "Years ago, when you were around 12, there was an incident involving Megan and a broken necklace that belonged to your mother. You remember that time, I'm sure. They blamed you because Megan said she saw you take it. But the truth is, she had broken it herself. I heard her tell a friend weeks later. She said she knew they would believe her over you." I felt the breath leave my body, not in shock, but in recognition. That memory had haunted me as a child, the way a single accusation can shift the way a family sees you. I had tried to explain myself, but no one listened. No one even paused long enough to consider my words. My mother had cried over the necklace. My father had grounded me for a week. Megan had stood there wide-eyed and innocent, clutching my father's arm while I insisted on the truth. I had buried that memory so deeply that reading it felt like reopening an old wound, but this time with someone finally saying, "You were right." My grandfather continued, "That day changed something in you. I saw it. You pulled back. You softened your voice. You began to believe that speaking up would only deepen your trouble. And I let it happen because I thought it wasn't my place. But it was. And I regret my silence." I wiped my cheeks, surprised to find tears there. Not painful ones, more like release, the kind that comes when someone finally acknowledges the version of you that you've carried alone. The letter went on. "I know about the wedding. I know you were told not to come. And I know you've been hurt again. But I also know you are not that 12-year-old girl anymore. You are a grown woman with strength none of them truly understand. I am asking you, Danielle, to attend the wedding, not for them, but for yourself." I read that line twice. "Go," he wrote, "as the woman you've become. Go, not to fight, but to stand in the truth of who you are. You deserve to be seen, and whether they admit it or not, they need you there, more than they understand." I pressed a hand to my mouth, breathing slowly. I hadn't realised until that moment how deeply I had needed someone in my family to believe in me. Someone who saw behind the surface. Someone who understood the years of silence weren't weakness, but survival. His letter gave me something I hadn't felt in a very long time: recognition. At the bottom, he had written one more sentence. "You do not have to shout to be powerful, Danielle. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who changes everything. I folded the letter carefully, pressing the crease as though sealing the truth inside for safekeeping. And as I set it down beside me, the steady clarity I had felt earlier sharpened into something even stronger. Not anger, not vengeance, purpose. My grandfather was right. I wasn't going to the wedding for Megan. I wasn't going for my parents. I wasn't going to expose the groom in some dramatic scene. I was going because I finally understood that I didn't need their permission to belong in my own family story. I knew I had to show up on my own terms. And the moment those words settled inside me, everything in my apartment seemed to shift, my posture, my breathing, even the quiet air around me. For the first time in years, I wasn't moving out of reaction or hurt. I was making a decision. A firm, deliberate step toward reclaiming a place in my own story instead of letting others write it for me. The wedding was still days away, but I felt as if I had already crossed an invisible threshold. I wasn't going as the overlooked daughter, or the inconvenient sister, or the quiet one who drifted along the edges of the room. I was going as a woman who understood her worth. The letter from my grandfather still lay on the couch beside me, its words holding a kind of steady warmth that reached deeper than I expected. His honesty had loosened something in me that had been tight for years. The girl who once retreated into silence had grown into a woman who could stand in a room full of people who doubted her and not shrink. That realization shaped everything that came next. The first thing I did was open my closet, not because I needed something extravagant, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because I wanted to choose something that felt like me, quiet, strong, and unmistakably present. I sifted through dresses I hadn't worn in years, blouses from conferences, simple outfits from ordinary days. But my hand stopped on a dress I had forgotten I owned. It was a soft, slate blue, elegant, without being showy with clean lines, that made me feel grounded the moment I touched the fabric. I held it against myself in the mirror and saw not a woman trying to impress anyone, but a woman who deserved to be there. I hung it on the door and stepped back. It felt right. Not dramatic, not loud, just honest. Next, I turned to the evidence, the documents, the complaint letter, the signature that had unsettled me so deeply. I placed everything into a slim folder, the kind I used for professional presentations. Holding it felt different now. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even leverage. It was protection, something that might matter if things went wrong. Something that could shield my sister or anyone else who might be harmed by the man she was about to marry. I didn't want to destroy him. That wasn't my goal. I wanted to protect the people who couldn't see what I now saw clearly. The difference mattered. It changed the tone of everything I planned to do. Still, protection didn't mean recklessness. I knew enough about men with secrets to understand they often reacted badly when cornered. So, I called someone I trusted. A lawyer I had worked with occasionally over the years, a woman named Elise, who believed in preparation as much as I did. When she answered, I explained the situation in careful measured steps, the old complaint, the threat on my phone, the concern for my sister's safety. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said, "You're right to take precautions. Bring the document with you and send me copies of everything so they're secured. If anything feels off at that wedding, call me immediately." Her voice was calm, steady, practical. It reassured me more than I expected. After we hung up, I scanned each document and sent them to her with a brief summary. Then I placed the originals into the folder and set it beside the dress. Looking at the two items together, the simple elegance of the dress and the quiet seriousness of the folder, I felt a sense of balance take shape. Both were part of who I was. Both were necessary. The next day, I took small but deliberate steps toward the version of myself I wanted to bring to the wedding. I went for a long walk through the neighborhood, letting the fresh air smooth out some of the tension that had built inside me over the last few days. I bought fresh flowers for the apartment, not out of sentiment, but because I needed the space to feel calm and unburdened. I made myself a good dinner, sat down with real intention, and let myself breathe. Every task felt like a quiet reclaiming of something I had lost over the years: my voice, my confidence, my presence in my own family. The night before the wedding, I laid everything out on the bed again. The dress, the folder, a small clutch bag, my car keys, even the shoes I had chosen, comfortable heels, nothing that would distract me from what I needed to do. Looking at them, I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel dread. I felt a steadiness I wished I had learned to feel earlier in my life. I brushed my hand over the dress, then over the folder, and thought about the girl I used to be, the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace, who avoided conflict even when she was right, who carried her hurt on the inside because she didn't want to burden anyone. She had survived in her own way, but she wasn't the woman walking into that wedding. I was. I thought of my grandfather again, of the gentle firmness in his letter. Go as the woman you've become. Those words echoed in me as I turned off the lights and lay down to rest. There would be a storm inside that wedding, whether anyone knew it or not. But I wasn't stepping into it to cause chaos. I was stepping into it to bring truth, to bring clarity, to bring the one thing my family never seemed to understand until it was too late: quiet strength. I drifted to sleep with an unusual kind of peace, one born from purpose, not comfort. And when dawn finally broke, I woke before my alarm, my mind clear and my hands steady. I felt ready, not because I knew how the day would unfold, but because I trusted myself more than I ever had before. I showered, dressed slowly, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked calm, dignified, and grounded. Not invisible. Not overlooked. Present. By the time I picked up the folder and slipped it into my bag, the only thing left to do was walk out the door. Then the wedding day arrived. And the moment I stepped out of my car and onto the gravel walkway leading toward the venue, I felt something inside me settle with a quiet, steady certainty. The sky was clear, touched with the soft morning light that comes just before a ceremony begins. The building ahead, an old renovated estate with white columns and wide windows, looked peaceful from the outside. But I knew that inside tension was already rippling through the rooms, threads of worry weaving tighter every minute. I wasn't arriving as a guest they expected. I was arriving as someone they had tried to erase, someone they feared might unravel the entire day. But I wasn't here to cause chaos. I was here to stand in the truth of who I had finally become. My heels clicked softly on the pathway as I approached the door. I held my small clutch in one hand, the folder tucked neatly inside, and took a slow breath before pushing open the entrance. The lobby was filled with soft music and muted voices, relatives chatting in small clusters, wedding planners, giving instructions, the kind of pre-ceremony busyness that usually carries excitement. But as soon as people turned and saw me, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a pause in the conversation here, a quick glance there. Then the whispers began, my name moving quietly between lips. Danielle. She came. I thought she wasn't invited. Did something happen? Their voices weren't harsh or cruel. They were startled, curious, searching. They had grown used to the story they had been told, the version where I stayed away, quiet and obedient. My presence disrupted that script completely. I didn't shrink under their eyes the way I once might have. Instead, I straightened my shoulders and walked forward with a calm, measured pace. I wasn't here to hide. I wasn't here to seek approval. I was here because I had chosen to be, and that choice carried a strength I could feel in every step. My mother noticed me before anyone else reacted fully. She turned from a group near the entry to the reception hall, her eyes scanning the lobby before landing on me. For a moment she froze, her breath catching visibly in her chest. She pressed a hand over her mouth as if trying to stop emotions from spilling out all at once. Then her eyes filled not with anger or confusion, but with something far softer, far heavier: relief and guilt. She moved toward me slowly at first, then, with desperate urgency, the heels of her shoes tapping unevenly on the floor. When she reached me, she didn't speak. She simply took my hands in hers and held them tightly, as if afraid I might disappear if she let go. Her voice trembled when she finally found it. "Danielle, you came." I nodded gently. I did. Her chin quivered, and for a moment she looked older than I remembered. Tired, worried, shaken by truths she was only beginning to understand. She squeezed my hands again, her eyes searching mine as if trying to read something she had never noticed before. "Thank you for being here," she whispered, her voice breaking in a way that told me she meant it. Before I could respond, movement at the far end of the hall caught my eye. Megan stood near the staircase that led to the bridal suite, her hair pinned elegantly, her dress still unzipped at the back as her bridesmaids fluttered around her. But she wasn't paying attention to any of them. Her eyes were fixed on me. The moment she saw me, she stopped breathing. Her lips parted slightly, and every expression, fear, hope, guilt, confusion, flashed across her face so quickly I could barely trace one before the next came. She didn't come running. She didn't call my name. She didn't perform anything for the relatives watching. Instead, she stood completely still as if my presence had pulled the ground out from under her. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. I saw every years-old memory reflected in her eyes, childhood secrets, teenage arguments, all the ways we drifted apart and all the things we never said. And beneath all of that, I saw fear, not of me, of what my being there meant. One of her bridesmaids touched her shoulder, asking if she was all right. But Megan didn't answer. She stared at me with the expression of someone standing between two worlds, the one she had built so carefully with lies and silence, and the one that threatened to collapse beneath the truth. I gave her a small, steady nod. Not a challenge, not a threat, a reassurance. I wasn't there to hurt her. I wasn't there to shame her. I was there because I would not abandon her even if she had tried to abandon me. But the groom reacted very differently. He appeared from a doorway near the catering prep area, adjusting his cufflinks, wearing the confident smile of a man who believed he had everything under control. But when he saw me standing with my mother, that smile vanished. His posture stiffened instantly, his jaw tightening, his shoulders squaring, as if he had been struck. For a brief second, his eyes betrayed him fear flickering behind his indignation. He hadn't expected me to come. He had relied on the message he sent. He had counted on my silence, the same silence my family had relied on for years. And seeing me there calm and composed unravelled something in him. He tried to mask it with a thin smile, but his hands betrayed him. They curled slightly at his sides, the way people do when they're preparing to defend themselves. He didn't approach me. He didn't greet me. He simply stared, assessing, calculating, panicking underneath his polished exterior. For the first time since everything had begun, the power dynamic shifted. The guests whispered. My mother held my hands as if anchoring herself. Megan stared with trembling conflict in her eyes. And the groom, the man who had stolen money, issued threats, and manipulated the story, looked as though the one person he needed out of the picture had just walked into the centre of it. I breathed slowly, letting calm fill me from the inside out. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't uncertain. I was exactly where I needed to be. A wedding planner hurried to the front, calling for everyone to take their seats. Cameras were being adjusted, microphones tested. The room began to change shape as people moved toward the ceremony hall, guided by soft announcements. And then the live stream started. And the moment those words became reality, the cameras switching on the soft music, fading, the guests adjusting in their seats, I felt the entire room shift. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. It was subtle, like the air tightening before a storm. I took my seat near the back, close enough to see everything but far enough not to draw attention. My hands rested calmly in my lap, my breath steady. I wasn't here to interfere. I was here to watch the truth unfold in its own time. The wedding host, a cheerful man hired by the venue, moved centre stage, just as the live stream counter flashed live in red at the top of the monitors. His voice carried easily through the microphone, smooth and practiced. Welcome, everyone, to this beautiful celebration, he said, smiling broadly. And to all our friends and family joining us online, thank you for watching. I glanced at the groom. He stood off to the side with his groomsmen, his expression pulled tight. He kept glancing at the cameras, then at me, then back again. His nerves weren't normal pre-wedding nerves. They were sharper, more frantic, the kind that come from trying to outrun something that refuses to stay buried. The host continued warming up the room. We're honoured today to celebrate the union of Megan Foster, and he paused, glancing at his notes. A gentleman who's had quite the interesting career journey, formerly with Hastings Financial Group, now branching into new business ventures. Something in the groom snapped. He didn't break publicly, not yet, but his reaction was immediate and violent in its subtlety. His shoulders jerked, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched. His hand hanging at his side curled into a fist. And his eyes, those smooth, polished eyes he showed the world, flashed with fear before he forced them neutral again. The host didn't seem to notice. Most people didn't. But people who watch closely, people who learn to read the spaces between words, notice everything. And the groom's reaction sent a ripple through the air around him. The guests shifted in their seats. A few exchanged confused glances. My mother lifted a hand to her throat. Megan, halfway down the staircase, with her bridesmaid still adjusting her dress, froze on the step. The cameras continued recording, streaming, going every second to the hundreds of viewers watching online. The host laughed lightly. I always love seeing where our brides and grooms have worked before. You never know how someone's path leads them to the love of their life. The groom's best man murmured something into his ear, but the groom didn't respond. He was too busy staring at the camera. Operator, as if he wanted to tear the microphone away and silence the world. And then, because tension always seeks release, someone in the audience let it slip. It came from 3 rows ahead of me, from a distant relative of my father's who had always been too blunt for polite company. He was older now, his voice louder than necessary. He turned halfway toward the groom and said plainly, Hastings, didn't you leave that place after some incident with an older lady's investment? The room went dead silent. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question tossed out by someone who didn't understand the weight behind it. But the effect was immediate. Guests straightened in their chairs. Heads swiveled. Bridesmaids paused mid-step. And the groom, his face drained of every ounce of confidence, took a sharp step backward, as if the words had struck him physically. A murmuring began, soft at first, then spreading like a brush fire. People whispered into one another's ears. A few looked directly at me, as though the pieces suddenly began drifting toward each other. And then someone shouted, not loudly, but clearly enough to be heard over the growing confusion. Did you ever pay back that old lady? That line hung in the air like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. The groom's expression twisted anger, panic, calculation, all fighting for control. His eyes darted toward the cameras again, toward the screens where the live stream displayed every second of growing tension, toward the people watching online who were now flooding the chat box in a frenzy. The host, visibly rattled, attempted to regain control of the room. Let's all take a seat. We're just moments away from starting. But no one was listening anymore. Someone near the front leaned toward her neighbour and whispered loudly. I heard he owed money, another gasped. Did Megan know? A man near the aisle muttered, If that's the same guy from the complaint my buddy told me about. The groom's breath became short and quick, the kind that comes from feeling cornered. His groomsmen looked at one another uncertainly, and the wedding coordinator, pale and wide-eyed, hurried toward him whispering harsh instructions. But the chaos wasn't limited to the room. The live stream chat projected on a small monitor near the aisle for the video team exploded with comments. Is this the same guy who scammed seniors? I swear I recognize his name. Someone look him up fast. What's happening? OMG! The groom looks terrified. Why did he flinch when the host said Hastings? The online audience, safe behind their screens, had no hesitation in drawing conclusions. And every second the cameras continued rolling, Their comments multiplied, spreading like wildfire through the live stream. I sat still, completely still. I didn't look away. I didn't intervene. I didn't rise or speak. My presence had already changed the room without a single word, and the truth, finally naturally, without force, was starting to surface through the cracks. In all the years my family had overlooked me, misunderstood me, dismissed me, they had never learned this about me. I don't need to shout to make truth visible. Sometimes you simply have to let people reveal themselves. My mother was staring at Megan, now seeing for the first time the fear her daughter could no longer hide. Megan clutched the railing of the staircase, her face pale, her eyes darting between the groom and the room as though she finally understood the danger she had been refusing to look at. The groom turned sharply, scanning the crowd, searching for me. When he found my face among the rows of guests, his expression shifted again. Not fear this time, but recognition. The kind of recognition a man has when he finally understands the quiet person he underestimated may have been the one holding the thread all along. But whatever he planned to do, whatever anger or denial or excuses he was preparing, he didn't get the chance to speak. Because the truth hadn't finished unraveling. And the real shock was yet to come. And I didn't have to wait long to see what that meant. The whispering had grown into a low rumble, guests shifting in their seats, turning their heads, trying to understand why the groom looked as though someone had pulled the ground out from beneath him. The live stream cameras kept rolling, capturing every uneasy movement, every strained breath. I could feel the tension rising like pressure in a sealed room, tight, concentrated, ready to burst. Then it happened. A man near the middle row stood up slowly, his face pale and stunned. He looked to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. His suit was slightly wrinkled, as though he had dressed in a hurry. For a moment, he simply stared at the groom with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not anger, not confusion. Something closer to disbelief mixed with recognition. He said, his voice steady but trembling at the edges. The groom's head jerked toward him, eyes widening in fear disguised as irritation. "Excuse me, can I help you with something?" he snapped, trying to regain control of the room through tone alone. But the man didn't shrink. He pointed, hand shaking. "You're the one who conned my grandmother 8 years ago. You came to her house. You promised to help her with her accounts. And then you disappeared with her money." The entire venue froze. The groom's face drained of colour. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. I have no idea what you're talking about," he stammered, each word breaking apart like brittle glass. But the man didn't waver. His voice grew stronger. "I never forgot your face. My grandmother cried for months because of you. And when I saw your name on the wedding invitation, I thought it couldn't be the same person. But just now, your reaction when they mentioned Hastings, that's when I knew." A collective gasp moved through the room like a wave. I sat perfectly still, not interfering, not stepping forward. I didn't need to. The truth was rising on its own like a tide no one could hold back. Before anyone could process his accusation, another voice rose from the back. A woman older, dressed in a floral dress, stood with both hands gripping the pew in front of her. "He took money from my neighbour," she said, her voice trembling. She trusted him. He told her she'd have enough to pay her medical bills. She didn't. The groom spun around, eyes wild. "This is ridiculous. I don't know these people," he shouted. But even as he said it, his voice cracked. And the room was no longer confused. It was convinced. Another man stood, then another, each one with a different version of the same story, a visit, a promise, a loss, a disappearance. Every voice added another fracture to the groom's carefully constructed image. It didn't matter that only a few of them had first-hand details. What mattered was that every story echoed the same pattern, and patterns don't lie. Megan, still frozen on the staircase, looked as though her entire world had split open at her feet. Her lips parted, her hands trembling at her sides. Her bridesmaids backed away, slowly unsure what to do. My mother covered her mouth again, tears already slipping down her cheeks. My father stared at the groom with a look I had never seen on his face before: regret. Deep, undeniable regret. But the groom wasn't focused on them. He was unraveling. His voice rose strained and cracking. "This is a setup. Someone put you all up to this." He pointed wildly around the room. "You don't know what you're talking about. You have no proof." He was sweating now, anger radiating off him in waves. "This is my wedding day," he shouted. "You people don't get to ruin it with your lies." A murmur spread across the room. Not disagreement, disbelief. His panic only fed their certainty. I watched him closely, my heartbeat steady. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't gleeful. I felt something much heavier. A sorrow for what Megan had walked into. A sorrow for the woman who had convinced herself she could build a life with someone she didn't understand. Then, one final voice rose from near the aisle. Soft, shaky. "My aunt, a young woman whispered, standing slowly. "He took money from her too." The groom whipped around toward her. "Shut up!" he yelled, voice cracking so violently the room recoiled. That was the moment everything broke. Shouting at a random guest was one thing. Shouting at a woman half his size in front of a room full of witnesses on a live stream watched by hundreds was another. It stripped away the last thin veil of composure he had been clinging to. Megan flinched, as though he had struck her instead. Her breath grew shallow, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and realization. She wasn't just seeing accusations. She was seeing the man beneath the surface, the man she had been too afraid to examine closely. The groom pointed toward the door. "Everyone sit down. This is getting out of hand." But no one sat. No one obeyed. Instead, they stared at him the way people stare at a fire, terrified and unable to look away. His panic was no longer concealed. He looked at Megan. "You believe this garbage, really?" She didn't answer. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. His face twisted. He spit out, "You're all insane." Then he snapped his gaze toward me. He saw me watching him, calm, steady, present, and something in him broke again. "You," he hissed, pointing at me. "This is your fault. You started this." But he was wrong. I hadn't started anything. The truth had simply found daylight. When he lunged a step in my direction, as if preparing to confront me, two groomsmen caught his arms, holding him back. He shoved at them, barking curses under his breath, but they didn't let go. Even they could feel the truth now. Even they had seen enough. Megan swayed on the stairs, her breath uneven. Her legs trembled beneath the weight of what she was witnessing. My mother wiped her tears, whispering Megan's name. My father stared blankly forward, unable to look away. And through all the chaos, all the shouting, all the trembling breaths and shattered illusions, one thing became painfully clear. My sister was breaking, and I could no longer sit in my seat. I knew Megan needed me, and by the time I rose from my seat and made my way toward the staircase, where she stood frozen, I no longer heard the shouting behind me. The room was still in turmoil, the groom fighting against his groomsmen guests, murmuring in disbelief, the livestream crew scrambling to mute microphones. But all of it felt distant, muffled like a storm raging behind a closed door. My focus narrowed to one thing, my sister trembling on the bottom step, clinging to the railing, as if it were the only solid thing left in her world. When I reached her, she didn't look at me right away. Her eyes were on the ground, unfocused, filled with a kind of shock that comes when the truth arrives too fast for the heart to catch up. Her shoulders shook beneath the layers of lace and satin. She looked like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff she didn't know she'd been walking toward. "Megan," I said softly. At the sound of my voice, she finally looked up. And the moment our eyes met, something in her collapsed. Not physically, emotionally. Every barrier she had spent years building between us, every lie she had told to keep herself protected, every distance she'd insisted on maintaining. It all broke in the space of a heartbeat. She threw her arms around me. It wasn't graceful or delicate. It was desperate. She clung to me with both hands shaking hard enough that I had to hold her steady. I didn't know, she whispered in a broken rush. Danielle, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Her breath hitched, and she sobbed against my shoulder, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place far below embarrassment or shock. This was fear. Genuine fear. The kind that sinks into a person when they realize how close they came to losing everything. I held her, smoothing her back the way I used to do when she was little and afraid of thunder. It's all right, I murmured. You're safe now. But she shook her head violently. No, it's not all right. I should have listened. I should have paid attention. I kept making excuses because he made me feel like it was my fault when he got angry. Her voice cracked again. I pulled back just enough to see her face. Tears streaked down her cheeks, her makeup smudging into uneven lines. She looked young suddenly, not the bride carefully presented to the world, but the girl who grew up beside me, the girl who never learned to tell the truth about what scared her. He isolated me, she whispered, little by little. He told me not to talk about our problems because people wouldn't understand. He said you'd judge me, that you'd try to make me leave him. He convinced me that you wanted to ruin the wedding because you were jealous. My chest tightened. Megan, why didn't you tell me? Because I was ashamed, she said through her tears. Because I thought I could fix it. Because every time he raised his voice, he'd apologize and make me think I overreacted. And I believed him. I thought it was just stress. I didn't want to disappoint Mum and Dad again. They were so happy for me. I was terrified to admit something might be wrong. She wiped her eyes with a shaking hand. And when you sent that email so calm, so polite, he panicked. He said you'd cause trouble. He made me believe that everything would fall apart if you showed up. I let him convince me to push you away. I'm so sorry. Her voice broke completely at the last word. Slowly, I reached into my clutch and pulled out the folder. Her eyes widened, confusion flickering across her face. I opened it and showed her the paper inside, the letter from Mrs. Calloway, the groom's signature, the proof he had hoped would stay buried forever. Megan's breath caught. She covered her mouth with both hands as she read. He did this, she whispered, to an elderly woman. He just took it. Yes, I said quietly, and likely to others too. Her knees buckled and I steadied her before she could fall. She pressed her forehead against my shoulder again, her words muffled and broken. You saved me. Danielle, you saved me. I felt her grip tighten, and for a moment we stayed like that. Two sisters who had finally stepped outside the roles our family had cast us in. Not the favoured one and the forgotten one. Not the troublemaker and the peacemaker. Just two women bruised in different ways, finally seeing each other clearly. I forgive you, I said gently. But we can't keep pretending things never happened. Not anymore. She nodded against me, her sobs slowing but her body still trembling. I'll make it right, she whispered. With you, with Mum, with everyone, I promise. I believe you, I said, but we'll take it one step at a time. She pulled back, wiping her cheeks. There was pain in her eyes, but there was clarity too, a kind of awakening. She looked toward the ceremony hall where the voices had grown louder. Again, the groom still shouting, still unraveling, still trying to claw his way back into control. I was really going to marry him, she whispered. If you hadn't come. I touched her arm gently. That's why I'm here. She nodded slowly, taking a shaky breath. What do I do now? We go together, I said. You won't face this alone. For the first time that day, her expression softened, not with relief, not with fear, but with trust. Real trust. The kind she had withheld for years without realizing it. She reached for my hand, and I took it. Her grip was warm, unsteady but determined. I led her down the last step. Both of us standing side by side now. Two sisters walking into the chaos of truth instead of the comfort of denial. But as we stepped forward, a harsh shout cut through the air. The groom had broken free from his groomsmen, and anger, dark, raw, uncontrolled, flashed across his face as he turned toward us. I tightened my hold on Megan's hand, feeling her tense beside me. But the groom wasn't done yet. And the moment he broke free from the groomsmen, that truth came barreling toward us with a force that made the entire room pull taut. Megan gripped my hand harder, her breath catching in her throat. His shoes slammed against the wooden floor as he stormed toward us, his face twisted with a fury he could no longer hide behind charm or polite smiles. "You," he spat, jabbing a finger at me as though I were the source of all his unravelling. "This is exactly what I warned her about. This is what you wanted. You couldn't stand seeing her happy. You had to sabotage everything." His voice echoed across the ceremony hall, sharp and frantic. Guests recoiled. Megan flinched. My mother pressed her hands to her chest. My father stepped forward instinctively, though he didn't say a word. I stood still, not moving an inch, letting the storm crash without giving it something to push against. He took another step closer. "Tell them," he shouted at me. "Tell them how jealous you've always been. Tell them you've hated her getting everything you never had. You couldn't let her have this one moment, could you?" For a brief second, I saw a flicker in the eyes of a few guests, a moment of hesitation, of uncertainty. Old narratives die slowly, and for years they had been fed a version of me that made this accusation seem almost plausible. But then those same guests remembered what they had just witnessed. His panic, his outburst, the accusations from multiple strangers, the live stream comments blowing up with confirmations. Hesitation dissolved as quickly as it appeared. A woman near the aisle shook her head. "I saw how you reacted earlier," she murmured. "This isn't about her." Another relative whispered, "He's trying to redirect." And someone in the back called out, "We know what you did." The groom spun toward them, eyes blazing. "You don't know anything," he yelled. "This is all her doing." He pointed at me again, voice cracking. "She's always hated me. She's been digging through my life, looking for something to use against me." Megan stepped forward, then her voice small but steady. "She didn't need to dig," she said. "You left damage everywhere you went." He whirled to face her. "You don't get to take her side," he snapped. "Not after everything I've done for you." It was the wrong thing to say. You could feel the shift, the final thread snapping. "For me," Megan whispered, trembling, "everything you've done has been to control me." He reached out as if to grab her arm, but I stepped between them before he could touch her. My movement wasn't aggressive. It wasn't grand. It was deliberate, a quiet, steady barrier he hadn't expected. His glare landed on me with a bitter intensity. "Of course," he sneered. "There you are, the savior, the perfect one." "Stop," I said softly, not loud, not commanding, soft but immovable. He lunged as if he wanted to shove me aside, but two relatives rushed forward, grabbing his arms. He fought them, shouting incoherently, now a mess of curses and accusations spilling out. The groomsmen joined in again, holding him back with more force than before. His panic was no longer hidden. The groom, who once walked into this venue as a polished, charming partner, was now flailing, yelling, desperate to break free. He looked toward the front entrance with sudden, wild focus. And that's when I realized what he intended. His ride was waiting. Outside the glass doors parked a sleek black car engine, running a driver leaning against it with a tense expression. The groom had planned this. Or, at least, he had prepared for the possibility that he might need to disappear quickly. Men with long trails of lies often do. He jerked violently, slipping free for half a second. That half second was enough for him to bolt. He sprinted toward the doors, nearly knocking over a floral display as he ran. Guests gasped. Someone shouted for him to stop. The wedding planner stepped aside, quickly, terrified of getting in his path. The groom's shoes hammered the floor as he raced toward the exit, panic driving each movement. But before he could reach the door, 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Time froze. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the livestream team stopped moving. The groom skidded to a halt, his breath ragged, his eyes widening in shock. The first officer lifted a hand. "Sir, we need you to stop right there." The groom stumbled backward. "What is this?" "Who called you?" "This is a private event." But the officers didn't waver. One of them spoke calmly. "We received multiple calls about allegations of financial misconduct and threats made to a guest. We need to ask you a few questions." His panic turned to raw terror. "This is ridiculous. You can't just... This is a wedding." The other officer stepped forward. "We're aware of that, and we're proceeding with caution. But we have statements from several individuals, and we need you to step outside with us." The groom looked around wildly, searching for someone to defend him. But the room was silent. No one stepped forward. Not a single family member, not a friend, not even his groomsmen. They all stood there watching the man they thought they knew fall apart in front of them. Finally, his gaze landed on Megan, pleading desperate. But she stared back with a look I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not hatred, heartbreak, and clarity. He whispered, "Megan, please." She shook her head slowly. "You lied to me from the beginning." He let out a strangled sound, part protest, part realization. And before he could run again, the officers gently but firmly took hold of his arms and guided him outside. The doors closed behind them with a soft, decisive thud. The crowd sat in stunned silence. It felt as though the air itself had stopped moving. I stood beside Megan, my hand still wrapped in hers. Her breathing was shallow, her shoulders trembling, but she remained upright, stronger than she realized. In the distance, muffled voices and the crackling radio of the officers filtered faintly through the glass. Guests slowly began whispering, some comforting one another, some shaking their heads in disbelief. But as heavy and final as the moment felt, I could sense it. There was still one more truth waiting to rise. One more thread that needed to fall into place before everything became clear. The truth had one more step to go, and those words felt almost prophetic as the doors closed behind the officers and the groom. The chaos inside the venue didn't fade. It shifted. It softened into a tense, stunned quiet, the kind that comes when people are not sure whether to breathe or brace for more. Megan stood beside me, her hand still gripping mine, her body trembling but upright. I could feel the shock radiating through her skin, the trembling of a woman whose life had just split open but had not yet settled into its new shape. One of the officers returned inside a few minutes later, scanning the room with calm professionalism. His expression wasn't harsh or accusatory, it was steady focus. He approached me directly and the crowd instinctively made space. My heart beat a little faster, but not out of fear. I had done nothing wrong, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the ground under me was solid. "Ma'am," he said, stopping just in front of me, "we were informed you might have relevant documentation regarding Mr. Harlow." His tone was respectful, not assuming, not pressing. I nodded. "Yes, I have it with me." Megan's grip on my hand tightened as if she needed to anchor herself to something steady. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the folder, the same one I had carefully prepared, the same one that had guided every step I took toward this day. The officer received it with gloved hands, opening it right there in the aisle. He flipped through the pages slowly, his eyes scanning the complaint letter, the signatures, the dates. Then he paused, taking out a small notebook from his pocket. "We've already received 3 separate reports today that reference similar incidents," he said. "If this document matches what we suspect, it may corroborate a pattern." His words were calm, but they landed across the room like a strike of lightning. Guests who had been whispering now went silent. Heads turned toward us. Even the wedding planner, still pale and shaken, stepped closer as if needing to hear every word. Megan leaned slightly into my shoulder, her breath uneven, her eyes fixed on the officer. She wasn't the only one who needed answers. "Would you mind waiting here while I show this to my partner?" the officer asked. "Of course," I said. As he walked toward the doors, the room shifted again. Not dramatically, not loudly, but perceptibly. People began to look at me differently, not with suspicion, not with confusion, but with dawning clarity. Whispered conversations changed tone. I could see it in their expressions, in the way their eyes softened, the way their posture adjusted. The story they'd been fed, the story that painted me as the problem, was dissolving in real time. My mother was the first to break. She moved toward me with hesitant steps, her face blotched with tears, her hands trembling as she reached for me. She didn't speak at first. She just looked at me with a devastation I had never seen in her eyes, an understanding that had arrived, years too late, sharp enough to cut through her own certainty. "Danielle," she whispered, voice breaking, How could we not have seen it?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She touched my arm gently, almost reverently, as if she had no right to do more. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "You tried to protect us, and we treated you like you were trying to hurt us. I am so sorry." Her apology wasn't loud enough for anyone else to hear, but in that moment her voice shook with a truth I had waited my entire life to feel acknowledged. Before I could respond, Megan collapsed against me again, sobbing into my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Danielle," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything. I never should have believed him. I should have trusted you." Her voice cracked with shame. "I kept pushing you away when you were the only one who ever looked out for me." I wrapped an arm around her, not out of victory, not out of justification, but out of something deeper. Compassion mixed with grief. After all, both of us were victims of the same pattern, just in different ways. "It's all right," I murmured. "You know the truth now." She cried harder. My mother cried with her. Even my father, who had always stood back, placed a hand on his forehead and let out a shaky breath as though seeing clearly for the first time in years. While they gathered themselves, the officer returned. His expression was firmer now, grounded in certainty. "Ma'am?" he said, addressing me. "The document you provided matches with at least 2 existing complaints. The signature is consistent and the dates line up with multiple witness statements. For now, we're considering this part of an active investigation." A ripple moved through the guests. Fear, indignation, disbelief, and relief, all mixing into a single collective exhale. The officer continued, turning slightly toward Megan, then toward my parents. "We'll need to speak with several of you individually over the next few days. But I can confirm that Ms. Foster's information has been extremely helpful." He looked directly at me again. "Thank you for stepping forward." The words didn't flatter me. They struck something deeper, a validation I had never expected to receive in front of my own family. The officer left to join his partner outside. When the doors closed behind him, the room seemed to come apart in quiet sobs and whispered conversations. Some guests hurried to comfort Megan. Others approached me cautiously, offering apologies or gratitude. My mother never stopped crying. She touched my shoulder, my cheek, my hand, as if she didn't know where to place her sorrow. But through it all, Megan clung to me physically, clung to me like a child who had been lost and finally found. "You saved me," she whispered again. "I don't deserve you." I rested my hand gently on her back. "You're my sister," I said. "No one deserves to walk through something like this alone." She cried harder. My father stepped closer, then, clearing his throat, his voice barely steady. "I don't know how we let this happen," he said quietly. "I don't know how we didn't see who you've become, who you've always been." His voice broke. "I'm sorry, Danielle. For once, I didn't shrink. I didn't explain myself. I didn't soften the moment to make anyone feel better. I simply stood there present, calm, steady in the truth of what had just unfolded." The room was shifting, The story was shifting. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't being spoken over or spoken for. I realised something then, something clear and sharp and long overdue. I had something I needed to say. And as those words settled inside me, I felt myself shift from the quiet observer I had always been into someone who finally understood she had the right and the responsibility to speak. The room was still heavy with the aftermath of everything that had unfolded, but there was also a strained, expectant calm settling over the guests. People had stopped whispering. My mother stood close, her eyes swollen from crying. Megan held onto my arm, as if letting go might cause her to collapse. Even my father, usually guarded and stiff, looked at me with an expression I had never seen from him before, open, remorseful waiting. I took a slow breath, letting my gaze sweep across the room. These were the people who had witnessed pieces of my life without ever truly seeing me. Some had believed the stories told about me. Others simply never questioned them. And I had stayed silent for so long that I wasn't sure where to begin. But when I opened my mouth, the words came, not rehearsed, not angry, not sharp, just honest. I want to say something, I said softly, my voice carrying farther than I expected in the quiet room. Not about him, but about us. The guests shifted, leaning in. My mother's hand flew to her mouth again. My father straightened. Megan squeezed my arm once more. For years I told myself that the way things were in this family was just how life worked. That every family had one child who shined a little brighter and one who learned to stay in the background. I swallowed, feeling the weight of the truth rising inside me. I convinced myself it wasn't worth bringing up when something hurt because I didn't want to make trouble. I didn't want to be the reason anyone argued. My mother let out a small gasp, but I kept going. When I was little, I thought, if I stayed helpful, if I stayed patient, if I stayed quiet, eventually I'd be noticed. Eventually someone would say, "We see you too." But that didn't happen. And the older I got, the more I accepted that maybe I didn't deserve that kind of attention. I felt Megan's grip tremble. And when I was blamed for things I didn't do, when I was ignored or brushed aside, I told myself it was easier to just accept it than to fight. I didn't want to be the problem. I didn't want to disappoint anyone. I didn't want to lose the little place I did have. My voice wavered, but I didn't stop. This was the moment I had carried with me for years, buried under quiet endurance. But what I learned, I said, steadying myself, is that silence doesn't keep you safe. It doesn't keep peace. It just hides the truth so well that eventually even you forget it's there. And when someone mistreats you, whether it's a stranger or someone you love, silence tells them they can keep doing it. I looked at Megan then, meeting her tear-filled eyes. I don't blame you for everything. I know now that you were scared too, and I'm glad you're safe. Truly glad. Then I turned to my parents. But I need you to know how it felt growing up, always being the one you didn't choose. I need you to know what that did to me. My mother was openly crying. My father's jaw tightened and he blinked rapidly, fighting emotion. I stood up for myself today, I said. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone, not because I'm jealous or petty or trying to ruin anything. I did it because if I didn't, someone I love would have been pulled into a life she didn't deserve. I did it because I couldn't stay silent anymore. Not today. Megan buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. And I want all of you to hear this. I continued, turning slightly to include the relatives watching from their seats. Standing up for myself doesn't mean I stopped loving my family. It doesn't mean I stopped caring. It doesn't mean I wanted to break anything. It means I finally learned that loving people doesn't mean letting them hurt you. A hush settled over the room, thick and reverent. I'm not asking for an apology, I said gently. I'm not asking for a do-over of the years we lost. I'm just asking you to really see me. Not as the difficult one, not as the quiet one, not as the one who should stay out of the way. See me as the woman who showed up today because she still cares enough to tell the truth. I exhaled, feeling something years of weight, maybe decades, untie itself from my chest. And I need you to understand one last thing, I said, my voice soft but unwavering. I'm not invisible anymore. I won't make myself invisible again. Not to keep the peace. Not to avoid conflict. Not to protect anyone from discomfort. I've earned my place in this family, and I'm claiming it now. The silence afterward was unlike anything I had experienced in my family's presence. It wasn't the old dismissive silence. It wasn't the tight-lipped silence of judgment. It was a listening silence, deep, humbled, present. People looked at me with expressions I had never seen aimed in my direction before. Recognition, respect, sorrow, admiration. My mother stepped forward first. She didn't speak. She simply walked up to me slowly, as if afraid I might step back, and placed her trembling hands on my shoulders. Her eyes were red, her face soft with emotion I had long stopped expecting from her. My father joined her, standing beside her with his jaw clenched and tears he didn't bother to hide. Megan held my arm with both hands, her face streaked with mascara but her eyes steady with gratitude and grief. And the guests, once silent witnesses to my quiet erasure, now looked at me with the kind of attention reserved for someone who had just changed the shape of a family. It was overwhelming but not frightening. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen. I could feel the years of heaviness, the old wounds, the swallowed words, the unspoken disappointments begin to lift from me, dissolving into something softer, lighter, almost unfamiliar. I had spoken my truth. And their response stunned me. And as I stood in the centre of that wedding hall, surrounded by the same relatives who had spent a lifetime looking past me, I felt a stillness settle over the room, so complete it was almost fragile. My chest rose and fell, slowly, the weight of years pressing lightly, instead of crushing me for the first time. It felt like standing in a doorway between two versions of myself, the one who had been invisible for decades, and the woman who had finally spoken her own truth. My mother still held my shoulders, her fingers trembling, as if she were afraid to lose contact. She looked at me with eyes I had never seen from her before, wet, full, searching. For a long moment, she didn't blink. She looked at me the way a person looks at something they thought they understood all their lives, only to realize they'd misunderstood everything. Her breath came in short, uneven pulls, and when she finally spoke, her voice wavered like a thin branch in the wind. "I need to say something," she whispered, turning her head so the guests could hear her. The tremor in her voice made several relatives lean forward, as if they sensed something important was about to break open. "I have made mistakes," she said louder now. "Many of them." My heart skipped. I had waited so long, too long, to hear her acknowledge even one. She swallowed hard. "I favoured Megan. I won't pretend otherwise. I told myself she needed more from me. And I told myself that Danielle was strong enough, independent enough that she didn't need the same attention." I saw the moment she realised the truth behind her own words. Her face twisted in regret, her mouth tightening at the corners, as if she suddenly tasted something bitter. "I was wrong," she said, and a tear rolled down her cheek. I didn't understand how much that hurt her. I didn't understand how much I was hurting her. And today, she paused, steadying her voice. Today, she showed more strength, more courage, and more grace than I think I've ever shown in my entire life. Several guests murmured quietly. Not gossip this time, but something closer to awe. My mother reached for my hand, but she did it slowly, hesitantly, like she wasn't sure she had the right anymore. "Danielle," she whispered, "I am sorry, truly sorry, for not seeing you, for not hearing you, for not loving you the way you deserve to be loved." Her voice broke. "You're the bravest person in our family, and I am ashamed that it took something like this for me to say so." I didn't cry. I expected to. Instead, a warm, quiet peace spread through my chest, like the soft glow from a candle that's been waiting to be lit. Then my father stepped forward. He cleared his throat the way he always did, when his emotions threatened to get the better of him. He looked at the guests, then at me, And for once, his expression wasn't distant or stiff or guarded. It was open, raw even. "I wasn't fair to you either," he said, voice low but steady. "I believed things about you that weren't true. I let the easy stories shape how I saw you. Megan seemed like the one who needed protecting." He paused, struggling to speak, past a lump in his throat. "But I see now that you were the one carrying the real weight." My breath caught. "You held this family together in ways we never acknowledged," he said softly. "You're the child I admire most. Not because you're perfect, but because you do what's right, even when it costs you something." He swallowed hard. "I should have told you that a long time ago." I felt something in me loosen, something I'd kept buried tight and deep, like an old knot, finally giving way. And then Megan stepped toward me. Her makeup was smeared tears streaking her cheeks in dark lines. But for once in her life, she wasn't reaching for a mirror or a bridesmaid or a camera. She was reaching for me. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling at her sides. "My sister saved me," she said, her voice hoarse but clear enough to fill the room. "Not just today. Many times. Times I didn't even realize." She blinked back tears. I pushed her away. I believed lies about her. I hurt her because it was easier than facing the truth about myself and about the man I almost married. Her voice cracked. "But she still came for me," Megan whispered. "She still protected me. And if she hadn't been brave enough to stand up for herself and for me, I would be walking into a life that could have destroyed me." She reached for my hand, gripping it with both of hers. "I owe her more than I can ever repay." Then she turned to the guests. "Danielle is the strongest person in this family, the most loyal, the most honest. And I'm proud she's my sister." A hush fell over the room, a different kind of hush than before. Not fear, not shock, something reverent. Guest after guest turned their eyes toward me, not with dismissal or pity or suspicion, but with something closer to respect, even gratitude. I felt the shift. It was subtle but unmistakable, like the first warm day after a long winter where the air itself feels different, lighter, kinder. I belonged. Not because I fought for it, not because I demanded it, but because I finally spoke the truth they had refused to see. For the first time in my life, I wasn't standing outside the circle of my family. I wasn't the overlooked daughter, the forgotten sister, the one expected to be quiet so others could shine. I was standing in my own place. My mother squeezed my hand. My father nodded with a pride I had never seen in his eyes before. And Megan leaned her head on my shoulder like she used to when we were children, and storms shook the windows at night. For the first time in years, I felt calm. Not the forced quiet I had lived with for most of my life, but the calm that comes from being understood, being heard, being seen. Around us, guests began stepping forward slowly at first, then more freely offering apologies, kind words, gentle touches on my arm. One aunt hugged Megan tightly. Another squeezed my hand and whispered, "We were wrong about you. I am so sorry." A cousin wiped her eyes and said she admired me. A friend of my parents said she wished she'd spoken up sooner years ago. And through it all, I didn't shrink this time. I let myself accept their words, their gestures, their acknowledgement. The truth had finally found me. And I finally found myself standing tall inside it. Just when I thought the moment had reached its natural ending, my mother stepped forward again. She wiped her cheeks, looked at me with a shy, tender hope I had never seen on her face, and said softly, "Danielle, would you stay a little longer?" And when my mother asked it, her voice soft and unsteady, I realised how different the room felt from the one I had walked into just hours before. I had entered as an outsider, bracing myself for bitterness, and cold glances, convinced that whatever happened at this wedding would deepen an old wound. Yet now, as guests drifted out in small, thoughtful clusters, and the tension in the air softened into something warm and fragile, I felt anchored in a way I had never felt with my family. Megan stood beside me, holding my hand as if she had no intention of letting go. My father remained close, watching me with quiet pride. My mother, red-eyed and exhausted, stayed only a breath away, as though she feared losing me again. I nodded gently. Yes, I'll stay. Relief washed over her features in a way that made her look years younger. She reached for my hand again, and though the touch was hesitant, it held sincerity I had never felt from her. As the final guests stepped outside and the staff dimmed the overhead lights, the hall grew still. No one said it out loud, but we all sensed the same need to leave the shattered ceremony behind and find somewhere smaller, quieter, more honest to breathe again. My father cleared his throat. "Why don't we go back to the house?" he suggested. "No big reception, no speeches, just us." Megan nodded immediately. "I'd like that." Then she turned to me. "If you're comfortable with it." I didn't answer right away. I took a moment to check in with myself, to feel the heaviness in my chest, the lingering adrenaline, the tenderness in my throat from speaking truths I had held for decades. But the idea of being in a smaller room with them didn't frighten me the way it once might have. There was no pretension left in them, no tension, no expectation that I would fade quietly into the background. For the first time, they wanted me there. "I'm comfortable," I said. "Let's go." The ride back to my parents' house was quiet, not in an awkward way, but in a peaceful, thoughtful one. Megan stayed close beside me in the back seat, her shoulder brushing mine. She didn't speak, but every now and then she looked at me with a tenderness I didn't recognize at first. Only later did I realize what it was: gratitude. When we stepped through the front door of the house I had grown up in, something in me tightened for a moment. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old carpet. The pictures on the walls, mostly of Megan birthdays, recitals, vacations, photos I used to walk past without pausing, telling myself it didn't matter. But tonight, they didn't sting the way they once had. Tonight, the house felt softer. My mother headed toward the kitchen. "I know this isn't a reception," she said with a weak smile, "but give me a few minutes. There's something I want to make." My father set his jacket aside and motioned for me to sit in the living room. Megan and I settled on the old couch, the one whose cushions remembered every childhood argument and quiet evening of homework. My father hovered near the bookshelf, running his hand along the edge as if searching for something to say. "You know he began slowly when you were little. You used to help me fix things around the house." "Do you remember that?" I blinked in surprise. "Bits and pieces." He nodded. "You were patient, careful. You asked questions. I always thought one day you'd be an engineer or someone who solved big problems." He looked down almost sheepishly. "I should have told you that. You were a remarkable kid." Megan listened with wide, earnest eyes, her hand wrapped around mine. My father continued, warming to the memory. "There was a time when the sink kept leaking and I couldn't get the pipe to stay in place. You were maybe 10. You tapped my arm and said, 'Dad, sometimes you have to look at something from under it instead of over it.'" He chuckled quietly. "And I'll be damned, you were right. We fixed it because of you." Hearing the memory felt like hearing a story about someone else entirely. "I didn't know you remembered that," I said softly. His eyes met mine, shimmering with regret. I remembered everything. I just didn't say it. And that was my mistake. A moment later, my mother returned carrying a small tray. She set it gently on the coffee table and stepped back with a shy tenderness. "I made you this," she said. "Your favourite." On the tray sat a warm dish of baked apples sprinkled with cinnamon sugar. A simple dessert one she used to make for me when I was very young, before the years when attention shifted away from me entirely. The moment I saw it, something in my chest tightened. I hadn't tasted it in decades. Megan let out a soft breath. "Mum hasn't made this in years." "For me," my mother replied, her voice small. "I used to make it for her all the time." I took a bite slowly. The warmth spread across my tongue, rich with memory. My mother watched me, her hands clasped nervously, waiting for something, maybe acceptance, maybe forgiveness. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I let the flavour remind me of days before resentment took root. "It tastes just like I remember," I said gently. My mother covered her mouth, tears welling. She sat beside me carefully, as if afraid of breaking whatever delicate thing had formed between us. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trying it, for being here, for giving us a chance to do better." We stayed like that for nearly an hour, eating in quiet conversation, sharing small stories, passing warm looks that felt like building blocks of a new kind of family. Megan leaned against me, and every now and then she murmured a small apology or a quiet thank you, or simply my name in a voice full of tenderness. My father shared memories I never knew he held. My mother tried to make me laugh just a little, and although none of it erased the past, it softened, it reshaped it, gave it room to breathe differently. I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the shadow of my sister's brighter life. I felt for the first time like part of them. But even with all the warmth in the room, all the healing and unexpected closeness, one moment from that evening stood apart from the rest, clearer and sharper than anything else. And that moment stood out to me. And it stood out because it was the moment when the evening finally quieted, when the warmth of the small family gathering settled into something peaceful and steady. My parents had begun clearing the dishes, moving around each other in a gentle rhythm I hadn't seen from them in years. The living room lights glowed softly. The air held the faint scent of cinnamon from the dessert my mother had made. Megan and I sat side by side on the couch, the noise of the day slowly fading from our bodies. For the first time since the wedding had fallen apart, silence felt safe. I could feel her glance at me a few times, each one followed by a deep breath she didn't quite finish. Her hands were clasped in her lap, fingers twisting nervously the way they used to when we were kids and she had something important to say. Only now, the stakes were different. This wasn't about a school argument or a broken toy. This was about years of distance, years of hurt, years of choosing the easy story instead of the true one. Finally, she turned toward me fully. Her eyes were still tired from crying, but there was a steady clarity in them now. "Danielle," she said softly, "can we talk? Just us?" I nodded, and she exhaled in relief. My parents seemed to sense the shift and quietly disappeared down the hall, giving us privacy. The house settled into a gentle stillness, one that wrapped around us like a blanket. Megan folded her hands more tightly. "I've been thinking about everything today." She began, her voice trembling just a little. "And everything before today. All the years we lost, all the times I let myself believe things about you that weren't fair." I didn't interrupt. I kept my gaze steady on her, waiting. She swallowed. "I've been jealous of you for as long as I can remember." The words came out bluntly without decoration. "Not because you were louder or brighter or more loved. Not because you got more attention, but because you didn't need it." She blinked hard. "You were steady, you could be alone, you could handle things. And I always felt like I couldn't." Her voice cracked then and she shook her head. "I didn't know how to handle that. Instead of learning from you, I punished you for it. I believed the worst things people said about you because it made me feel safer. It made me feel like you weren't ahead of me, like I wasn't failing." She wiped her cheek. "And when I met him, when he started whispering things about you, feeding my insecurities, telling me you were jealous or controlling, I let myself believe him. I let him use the parts of me I never dealt with." Her hands unclasped and she reached down beside the couch. When her hand came back up, she held something small, something I hadn't seen in more than 20 years. "I need to give you this," she whispered. It was a tiny wooden bird, painted blue with little strokes of gold along the wings. My grandfather had carved it for me when I was 8. I carried it everywhere for years, keeping it in my pocket during school, placing it on my nightstand at bedtime. It was one of the few things that had felt entirely mine. I stared at it, stunned. I thought I had lost it. I had searched for it for days, then weeks, before eventually giving up and assuming I'd misplaced it. But I hadn't. She had taken it. Megan held it out with trembling fingers. "I stole it," she said. "I told you that you must have dropped it, but I took it because I wanted something that was yours. something that made you special. I kept it all these years. I'm sorry, Danielle. I'm so sorry. I didn't understand what I was doing back then, but I knew enough to know it was wrong. I picked up the little bird, slowly feeling its familiar weight in my palm. A flood of memories washed over me, how proud I'd been when Grandpa handed it to me, how I'd shown it to everyone, how it had disappeared and taken my trust with it. You could have told me years ago, I said gently, not accusing, not angry, just true. I know, she whispered. I was embarrassed. And then too much time passed. And then I didn't know how to bring it up without looking even worse. Her voice trembled. But today, after everything you did for me, I couldn't keep hiding behind excuses. I looked at her, then really looked at her. She wasn't the girl who had always been handed the bigger slice of cake or the prettier dress or the easier path. She wasn't the young woman who sought attention because she thought it proved something. She wasn't the frightened fiancé who clung to a charming lie. She was just Megan. My sister, flawed, hurting, trying to grow. I set the little bird down in my lap and reached for her hand. I accept your apology, I said softly, but I need you to understand something. Healing doesn't happen overnight. I forgave you, but that doesn't mean everything just resets. I want us to rebuild, and I want it to be real this time. But we'll have to go slowly. Her shoulders sagged in relief. I'll take slow, she whispered. I'll take whatever pace you're comfortable with. I don't want to lose you again. You won't, I told her, not if we both keep doing the work. Something in her face shifted, then something warm, grateful, deeply sincere. She leaned toward me hesitantly, as if waiting for permission. When I didn't pull away, she slid closer and wrapped her arms around me. It wasn't a dramatic embrace. It wasn't the kind of hug that squeezes the breath out of you. It was gentle, careful, honest, the kind of embrace that said we were meeting each other as equals, now two women, two sisters, choosing to grow in a way we had never done before. I closed my eyes and let myself sink into it. For the first time in our lives, the balance between us felt right. We stayed like that for a long moment until the tension in her body softened and her breaths evened out. She finally pulled back, wiping her face with her sleeve, and let out a shaky laugh. I can't believe today happened, she said. Everything we went through, and somehow we're here. I nodded. It was a lot, but maybe it was necessary. We sat quietly for another minute, absorbing the strange, tender peace settling over the room. Then I glanced toward the window and noticed the sky outside had deepened into a quiet blue, the last light of day fading into evening. I took a slow breath and stood. It was time to go home. And as I stood from the couch, I felt that truth settle inside me, not as an escape, not as a retreat, but as a gentle closing of a long, complicated chapter. My parents emerged from the hallway just then, as if they sensed the moment. My mother's hands were still damp from washing the last of the dessert dishes, and my father had slipped back into his shoes, though he hadn't tied them yet. Megan rose beside me, her face still soft from our conversation, her eyes following my movement with a kind of tenderness I wasn't used to seeing from her. I should head out, I said quietly. It's been a long day. My father nodded slowly. Let us walk you to the door. It wasn't a request, it was something deeper, an instinct, a gesture of respect I hadn't known from him before. He walked ahead of us, opening the hallway light, waiting for us to join him. My mother hovered at my side, as though she feared losing this new closeness if she stood even a step behind. And Megan stayed close to my other side, one hand lightly curled around my arm. The house felt smaller than I remembered, but warmer too. Each step toward the front door felt like rewriting an old memory. I used to walk this hallway quietly, unnoticed, slipping out for school or for work without a glance. But tonight, each footfall echoed with a sense of belonging I had never felt here before. My mother reached the door first and touched the knob gently, as though the metal itself held meaning. Before you go, she said softly. I want to thank you. She turned to me, her hands clasped together. Not just for helping us today, not just for protecting Megan, but for giving us a chance to be better parents to you. We can't change the past, but we can do better moving forward. And we will. Her voice trembled at the end. I felt a warmth settle in my chest, steady and calm. I nodded. Thank you for saying that. My father stepped closer. He rubbed the back of his neck, a habit of his, when he was emotional, and let out a breath. I know we don't deserve another chance, he said quietly. Not with how we treated you. But I hope you will let us try. There was something raw in his eyes, a vulnerability I had rarely seen from him. It wasn't weakness. It was truth. And for the first time, he wasn't hiding behind authority or silence. I'll give you that chance, I said, but it will take time. He nodded, accepting that without hesitation. Time is something we're willing to give. Megan stepped in front of me, then her eyes shining with emotion. She had washed her face earlier, but a faint trace of mascara still rimmed her lashes. She placed both hands gently on my arms. I want to walk this road with you, she said. Not beside you because I'm favoured, not ahead of you because I was pushed there, but next to you, as your sister. Her voice thickened with emotion. If you'll let me. I took her hands. I'll let you. Just take it slow, Megan. She nodded, tears gathering again. I will. I promise. As I reached for my coat, something unexpected happened, something that nearly brought me to tears. My mother tugged lightly at my sleeve and said, "Just a moment." She hurried back into the living room and returned with a soft blue scarf, folded neatly in her hands. You always used to wear this when you were younger, she said. You loved the colour. I found it in the hall closet earlier. She held it out to me. I want you to take it. It feels like it belongs with you. I accepted it slowly, running my hand over the familiar fabric. It had been mine once back when childhood still held hope. Holding it now felt like recovering a piece of myself I hadn't realised I'd lost. Thank you, I whispered. She touched my cheek gently, her thumb brushing the edge of my jaw. Take care of yourself on the drive home. My father opened the door then. The cool evening air drifted into the hallway, carrying the scent of damp leaves and the quiet stillness of a day finally winding down. It washed over me like a cleansing breath, clearing away the tension of the day. As I stepped outside, something surprising happened. A few relatives, my aunt, 2 cousins, and my mother's old friend were gathered quietly on the porch, talking in low voices. When they saw me, they straightened, and their expressions softened into something unexpected. Admiration. Not pity, not curiosity, not the tight, uncomfortable politeness I had grown used to receiving at family gatherings. Admiration. My aunt approached first. Danielle, she said softly, we're proud of you. Truly, you carried yourself with such strength today. A cousin nodded. You protected your sister. You protected this whole family. We should have seen you more clearly sooner. Another relative squeezed my hand. You handled everything with dignity. You showed us all something important. Their words weren't dramatic or loud. They were steady, sincere, and deeply felt. And as each one spoke, I felt something inside me loosen further. Years of being overlooked, minimized, misunderstood, dissolving, like dust brushed from old fabric. I thanked each of them quietly. Their kindness wasn't something I needed to survive, but it was something that brought a gentle peace I didn't expect to feel tonight. When I turned back toward the doorway, my mother was watching me with a soft, proud smile. My father stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back. Megan leaned on the doorframe, her arms wrapped around herself, her expression filled with warmth. Drive safe, my father said. We love you, my mother added, her voice trembling again. Megan pressed her palm to her heart. Call me when you get home. I will, I said. I stepped off the porch slowly, the cool air brushing against my newly regained sense of peace. The ground felt solid beneath me. My steps felt lighter than they had in decades. I walked toward my car with a calm, steady breath, the night quiet around me. As I opened the car door, I paused and looked back at the house. My family stood together in the doorway, unified, humble, hopeful. They looked at me with gratitude, respect, and something deeper, recognition. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was leaving them behind or escaping the weight of history. I felt like I was stepping forward from a place of truth, carrying only what I needed, leaving behind what I no longer had to hold. I climbed into the driver's seat, set the little wooden bird beside me, and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the quiet street, casting long, gentle beams across the pavement. I took one last breath of the cool night air and pulled away slowly from the curb. But the final realization came when I opened my own door. And as that door swung inward, a soft hush settled over my home, the kind that only comes when a long day releases its grip and lets the night wrap itself around you. I stepped inside, slowly closing the door behind me with a gentle click. The quiet was almost startling. No voices, no tension in the walls, no expectations waiting for me in the next room. Just stillness, peaceful, steady stillness. I took a breath, letting my shoulders drop for the first time since the morning. The air held the familiar scent of fresh linen and the faint trace of the candle I'd blown out before leaving that morning. It felt comforting, like slipping into a room where every piece of furniture knew me better than my own family ever had. For a moment, I didn't move. I simply stood there, allowing the weight of the day to loosen from my body slowly and fully. My eyes drifted around my living room. The neatly arranged books, the framed photos from travels I'd taken alone, the soft throw blanket draped over the arm of the couch. Nothing here asked me to shrink or stay silent. Nothing reminded me of old comparisons or bruised memories. This place, in every small detail, reflected who I had become on my own terms. And tonight, for the first time, I truly felt the difference between loneliness and solitude. One had once haunted me. The other now grounded me. I set my keys on the small side table by the door and placed my coat over the back of a chair. When I glanced down, the little wooden bird sat in my hand, familiar, worn smooth from years of being held long ago. I had almost forgotten I was still carrying it. Slowly I walked over to my bookshelf and found a small open space right at eye level. I set the bird there gently, its blue paint catching the lamplight. It looked like it finally belonged. As I stepped back, a quiet ache rose in my chest, not painful, not heavy, just an echo of all the years when I believed I didn't deserve more than the shadows. I thought about the little girl I once was, the one who tried to make herself small so no one would think she was asking for too much. I thought about all the birthdays where I smiled through the quiet, all the celebrations where I clapped for Megan, while my own milestones passed without notice. I remembered the nights I told myself it didn't matter, even though it did. It mattered deeply, and I carried those wounds for years, letting them shape how much of myself I allowed into the world. Tonight, standing in my own living room after everything that had happened, I finally understood something that had eluded me for most of my life. The silence I carried had never been mine to hold. It had been given to me by others, by their choices, their blind spots, their need to make me the easy one. I was done carrying it. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, letting the coolness ground me. As I sipped it, I felt the truth settle. Deeper inside me, standing up for myself had not destroyed my family. It had saved them. It had saved me. And it wasn't just about the groom or the wedding or the drama of the day. It was about rewriting a story I thought I was trapped in forever. People talk about revenge as something sharp, something fueled by anger or bitterness. But that was never what this was about. Yes, there had been hurt. Yes, there had been unfairness. But the justice I found today wasn't about watching anyone fall. It was about finding the courage to stand. It was about reclaiming my voice, my worth, my place in the world. It was about showing myself that I didn't need to stay quiet, to be loved or invisible to keep the peace. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about taking back the parts of myself I had given away to make others comfortable. The room felt warmer now, as if the walls themselves understood the shift within me. I walked to the couch and sat down, running my fingers lightly along the blanket, feeling its soft texture. The house murmured with the calm hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the wall clock, the familiar small sounds that pulled me gently back into myself. Everything was simple here, true, mine. I leaned back, letting my head rest against the cushion. My phone buzzed softly on the coffee table. It was Megan sending a simple message. Home safe, I love you. Another came a moment later from my mother. Call us tomorrow. Sleep well. Even my father sent a brief, clumsy text, proud of you. Good night. The messages didn't make me emotional, not in the old way. They made me feel balanced, seen, respected, and I knew that when morning came, things would not magically become perfect. Healing would take time. Trust would need rebuilding. But the ground beneath us was different now. More honest, more equal, more real. I set the phone aside and closed my eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the quiet fill me up. The heaviness of the day lifted inch by inch, replaced by something new. Something that felt like hope, but also like strength. When I opened my eyes again, I felt lighter than I had in decades. The girl who once tiptoed through life, afraid of making noise, had stepped into the world today, with her voice steady, her spine straight, and her truth clear. And she wasn't going back. I stood and walked toward the hallway, ready to wash up and settle into bed, when a soft, unexpected thought settled quietly in the back of my mind. Everything that happened today, the truth, the pain, the justice, the healing, was not an ending. It was a beginning of a life where I didn't mold myself around other people's comfort. A life where my worth wasn't measured by how little space I took. A life where I could love my family without losing myself. As I turned off the light and stepped into the quiet of my home, I felt that beginning rise inside me like a small flame, steady, warm, undeniably mine. And this was only the beginning. As I look back on everything that happened, I understand now that this journey was never simply about a wedding, unraveling, or a truth finally being exposed. It was about gathering the parts of myself I had pushed aside for so long, parts I hid to make room for others in a space where I never should have felt small. When I stepped into my home that night and closed the door behind me, a gentle clarity settled over me. Real peace doesn't come from people suddenly treating you better. It begins the moment you stop treating yourself as though you deserve so little. For years, I convinced myself that silence was safer than honesty. I told myself that avoiding conflict made me calm and mature. I feared that speaking up would stretch the distance between us until it felt unbridgeable. But I learned something important. Silence doesn't protect you. It contains you. It keeps hurt stored in the darkest places where it grows unnoticed. And although truth may shake the foundation, at first it creates room for light to enter the places that have been hidden for far too long. The path ahead for me, for my sister, for my parents will not be effortless. There will be moments when one of us slips into old habits, where misunderstandings surface again, or where trust must be rebuilt with patience rather than urgency. But something significant shifted between us. They see me now with clearer eyes, and I see myself with a steadiness I did not know I was missing. My sister and I are beginning to choose each other intentionally as grown women who want a relationship built on honesty rather than childhood roles. My parents are learning the hard work of listening without defensiveness and loving without conditions. These steps are small, but they are sincere. And as for me, I am walking forward with a truth I once doubted. I am worthy of gentleness. I am worthy of being loved without shrinking who I am. I am worthy of standing in the center of my own life instead of living quietly along its edges. For the first time, I no longer question whether I'm allowed to take up space. I know now that I am. If any part of this journey echoes something within you, if you've ever felt overlooked in your own family or carried weight you were never meant to hold. I hope my story offers you something to keep close. Perhaps courage to speak aloud what you've been holding inside. Perhaps reassurance on a day you feel unseen. Or perhaps just a reminder that your voice matters even if it trembles at first. Before we end this chapter, I want to thank you with sincerity. Thank you for walking with me through every turn, every painful reveal, every step toward healing. Stories like this resonate because they reflect the quiet struggles so many people carry alone. When we share them, we remind each other that we're not isolated in those experiences. I would truly love to hear from you. Did any moment in this story feel familiar? Did the sister's journey remind you of a relationship from your own life? One you're healing, rebuilding, or still trying to understand? Maybe this story brought forward thoughts about your own strength or the boundaries you've been afraid to draw. Whatever came to mind, I hope you'll share it in the comments. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if this story touched you, if it offered comfort, insight, or simply companionship, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. More stories are on the way, stories that explore family bonds, forgiveness, resilience, and the quiet but powerful bravery of people who rise after being pushed aside. Each new subscriber strengthens our community, and I would love for you to be part of what comes next. Before you go, I'd love to know your biggest takeaway from Danielle's journey. Was it a moment of confrontation, a moment of release, a moment when she finally recognized her own worth? Whatever stayed with you, I hope you'll share it below. Someone else watching may find courage in your words. Thank you once again for being here, for listening with an open heart, and for supporting stories that honor truth and healing. I hope you'll stay with us for the next chapter.